In the year 476, as summer gave way to autumn across the hills and valleys of Gaul, an age was ending. The last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, handed over the imperial regalia to a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. The purple that had clothed Roman shoulders for 5 centuries was folded away, and with it the unified administration that had governed these lands since Julius Caesar first crossed the Alps. Yet for the people living in the stone-walled cities and vine-covered countryside of Gaul, this distant political change in Ravenna brought not sudden chaos, but rather the gradual recognition of what had been reality for decades. Roman authority had been fading like morning mist before the sun, retreating year by year as new peoples settled into the rhythm of the land. The Visigoths had already established their court in the warm southern city of Toulouse, their Gothic warriors now ruling over olive groves and Roman estates that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Loire. Their king Euric moved through marble-columned halls that had once echoed with Latin rhetoric, now filled with the deeper consonants of Germanic speech and the rustle of animal skin cloaks worn over Roman silks. In the mountainous east, the Burgundians had made Lugdunum, which the Romans called Leon, their royal seat. Here, where the Rhone and Saône rivers met in ancient confluence, King Gundobad held court in a palace overlooking terraced vineyards. His people, with their fair hair and tall frames, had learned to appreciate Roman wine and Roman law, yet they maintained their ancestral customs of personal loyalty and warrior honour. Between these kingdoms, scattered across the fertile plains of northern Gaul, the Frankish tribes were also taking root. Unlike the Visigoths and Burgundians, who had established centralized kingdoms with defined borders, the Franks remained divided into smaller groups, each following their own chieftain, each controlling territories that shifted with the seasons of war and marriage, alliance and betrayal. The Roman Gallic population, descendants of Celtic tribes who had lived under Roman rule for 4 centuries, adapted to these changes with the quiet resilience that comes from deep roots in familiar soil. In the cities, Roman administrators continued their duties under new masters, using the same legal codes and bureaucratic procedures, only now serving Germanic kings instead of distant emperors. In the countryside, farmers still planted their fields according to the ancient calendar, still brought their grain to the same stone mills their grandfathers had used, still gathered in market squares that had been trading centres since Celtic times. The Christian bishops, inheritors of both Roman administrative skills and spiritual authority, emerged as bridges between the old world and the new. In cathedral cities like Tours and Reims, these men of God maintained libraries, supervised schools, and offered counsel to Germanic kings who respected their wisdom even when they did not fully share their faith. Into this world of competing kingdoms and shifting allegiances came a young Frankish chieftain, whose name would echo through the centuries, Clovis, grandson of the legendary Merovech, from whom his dynasty would take its lasting title. At 15, he inherited leadership of the Salian Franks, one of several Frankish groups scattered across the lowlands between the Rhine and the Somme. The year 486 brought the moment that would transform not only Clovis's own destiny, but the future of all Gaul. Near the town of Soissons, where Roman walls enclosed streets that had known 5 centuries of imperial order, the last Roman governor in Gaul, a man named Syagrius, had maintained a curious independence. Neither fully Roman nor barbarian, neither emperor nor king, he ruled his small territory like a bridge between 2 ages. Clovis approached Syagrius's fortress with the measured confidence of a hunter who has studied his prey. The battle itself was swift, decided more by the loyalty of soldiers to their leaders than by tactical brilliance. When the dust settled on the September fields, Syagrius lay dead, and Clovis held in his hands the keys to Roman administrative knowledge, to trained bureaucrats who understood taxation and law, to the symbols and ceremonies that could transform a tribal chieftain into something approaching a king. But Clovis possessed a wisdom that went beyond mere conquest. He understood that lasting power in this land required more than Germanic warriors and Roman administrators. It required the blessing of the God whom increasing numbers of his subjects worshipped, the Christ whose bishops had become the most educated and influential men in every city. The moment of his conversion has been preserved in chronicles written by monks who saw in it the hand of divine providence. During a desperate battle against the Alemanni, with his forces wavering and defeat threatening, Clovis called upon the God of his Christian wife Clotilde. "Jesus Christ," he prayed, according to the chronicler Gregory of Tours, "if you grant me victory over these enemies, I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." Victory came, as prayer makers have always insisted it would, and Clovis kept his promise. On Christmas Day, in the year 496, he descended into the baptismal waters of Reims Cathedral, his long hair flowing around his shoulders, as Bishop Remigius spoke the ancient formula that would bind this Frankish king to the Christian God, and, equally importantly, to the Christian bishops who administered that God's earthly kingdom. With this baptism, Clovis achieved what no other Germanic king in Gaul possessed: complete religious unity with his Roman Gallic subjects. While Visigothic and Burgundian rulers remained Arian Christians, following a doctrine that most of their Roman subjects considered heretical, Clovis embraced Orthodox Catholic Christianity. The bishops who had maintained distant courtesy toward Arian kings opened their hearts and their treasuries to this Frankish convert. From Paris, which became his favoured residence, and Reims, which became his spiritual capital, Clovis began the methodical unification of the Frankish tribes. Through marriage alliances, strategic battles, and careful diplomacy, he drew the scattered Frankish chieftains under his authority. Each submission was sealed with oaths sworn upon Christian relics, each alliance blessed by bishops who saw in Frankish unity the promise of religious orthodoxy. By the time Clovis died in 511, he had created something unprecedented in post-Roman Gaul, a unified kingdom stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, from the English Channel to the Mediterranean, ruled by a Catholic king who commanded the loyalty of both Frankish warriors and Roman bishops, Germanic nobles and Gallic administrators. Yet even as Clovis created this unified realm, he sowed the seeds of its future fragmentation through the ancient Frankish custom of partible inheritance. Upon his death, the kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, each receiving a portion of the royal treasure, the royal lands, and the royal responsibilities. This partition would become the persistent pattern of Merovingian rule. Unification under strong kings followed by division among their heirs, then gradual reunification through conquest or marriage, only to be divided again when the next generation reached maturity. Paris became the heart of one kingdom, Orléans of another, Soissons of a third, while Reims anchored the 4th. Each royal court developed its own character, its own alliances, its own ambitions. Brothers made war upon brothers with the casual frequency of changing seasons, while their queens whispered counsel that ranged from the pious to the poisonous, depending upon their reading of immediate advantage. The most remarkable of these royal women was Brunhild, a Visigothic princess who married into the Merovingian dynasty and spent 40 years navigating its treacherous politics. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless, she survived the assassination of one husband, the mysterious death of another, and countless palace conspiracies, always managing to secure power for her sons and grandsons. Her rivalry with Queen Fredegund of Neustria became legendary, a deadly chess game played with armies and assassins, marriage alliances, and monastic foundations. Yet beneath this royal turbulence, Frankish society was finding its distinctive rhythm. In the great halls of wooden palaces, Germanic warriors sat at long tables beside Roman aristocrats, sharing roasted meat and fermented honey wine while listening to songs that blended Latin verses with Germanic saga poetry. The fusion of cultures created something new, neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but uniquely Frankish. The countryside settled into patterns that would endure for centuries. Roman villas were adapted into Frankish manor houses, their classical proportions modified to accommodate large hearth fires and communal sleeping chambers. Former Roman slaves became Frankish serfs, bound to the land but protected by customs that gave them rights as well as obligations. Free Frankish farmers maintained their ancestral privileges, gathering in assemblies to witness legal proceedings and approve royal decisions. Christianity spread gradually through this society, less by royal decree than by patient missionary work. Irish monks established monasteries in forest clearings, teaching agricultural techniques alongside Christian doctrine. Frankish nobles founded churches on their estates, sometimes more for the prestige of patronage than from deep religious conviction, but the result was the same: a network of Christian institutions that gradually wove itself into the fabric of daily life. The mayors of the palace, originally household administrators responsible for managing royal estates and organizing royal courts, began to accumulate real political power as kings became increasingly concerned with the ceremonial aspects of rule. These mayors controlled access to the king, managed royal finances, and commanded royal armies. In kingdoms where kings changed frequently through violence or early death, the mayors provided continuity and practical governance. By the late 7th century, real power in the Frankish kingdoms had largely passed to one family of mayors, the descendants of Pepin of Herstal, whose grandson would bear a name that echoed like a hammer blow through medieval history: Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. Charles inherited a fractured realm where Merovingian kings ruled in name only, their long hair and ceremonial authority masking complete political impotence. The real business of government collecting taxes, raising armies, dispensing justice, negotiating with foreign powers, had become the exclusive domain of the mayors. Charles embraced this reality with the straightforward practicality of a man born to command. His greatest test came in the autumn of 732, when Muslim armies that had conquered Spain crossed the Pyrenees and advanced deep into Frankish territory. Led by Abd al-Rahman, governor of Islamic Spain, these forces represented not merely a military threat but a civilizational challenge. Would Christian Europe end at the Loire River? Would the call of the muezzin replace church bells in the cities of Gaul? Between Tours and Poitiers, on an October day when the leaves were turning gold and scarlet in the surrounding forests, Charles met this challenge with an army that embodied all the cultural fusion of Frankish society. Germanic warriors stood beside Romanized Gauls, Christian devotion combined with barbarian ferocity, and careful tactical planning merged with desperate courage. The battle itself was decided by disciplined infantry standing firm against repeated cavalry charges. For 7 days the two armies faced each other across the rolling countryside, skirmishing and manoeuvring, each commander waiting for the perfect moment to commit his reserves. When the decisive clash finally came, it was Charles's heavy infantry, formed into dense squares like ancient Germanic tribes had once formed against Roman legions, that held the field while Abd al-Rahman fell beneath Frankish spears. The victory at Tours established Charles Martel as the dominant figure in Western Europe, a Christian champion who had turned back the tide of Islamic conquest. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Frankish kingdom, despite its internal divisions and ceremonial kingship, remained a formidable military power when properly led and motivated. Charles used this prestige to extend Frankish authority into regions that had drifted toward independence. Bavaria, Alemannia, and Frisia all felt the weight of Frankish arms as Charles methodically expanded and consolidated his family's power. He established monasteries, endowed churches, and cultivated relationships with Christian missionaries, understanding that religious authority could be as valuable as military victory in securing lasting control. His son Pepin, called the Short for his modest stature but possessing his father's political acumen, inherited a curious situation: complete practical authority exercised in the name of powerless kings, whose only remaining function was to ride in ceremonial carts during public festivals, their long Merovingian hair carefully combed and their royal regalia properly displayed. Pepin resolved this anomaly through a diplomatic masterstroke that would reshape the relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority throughout medieval Europe. He sent envoys to Pope Zachary in Rome with a carefully crafted question: is it right that kings who have no royal power should continue to bear the title of king? The Pope's response was equally diplomatic and equally revolutionary. It is better that he who has the power should be called king rather than he who remains without royal power. With papal approval secured, Pepin moved swiftly. In 751, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed and confined to a monastery, his ceremonial hair shorn in symbolic surrender of royal authority. Pepin was then elected king by the assembled Frankish nobles and anointed with holy oil by Bishop Boniface, the papal representative. This anointing ceremony, borrowed from Old Testament accounts of Hebrew kingship, established a precedent that would echo through centuries of European history. No longer would kings rule simply by virtue of birth, conquest, or election by warriors. Now they ruled by the grace of God, their authority sanctified through Christian ritual, their legitimacy dependent upon church approval. The age of the Merovingians had ended. The age of the Carolingians, named for Charles Martel, was about to transform not only the Frankish kingdom, but the entire concept of European kingship. When Pepin the Short died in 768, his kingdom passed to two sons according to the ancient Frankish custom that had shaped Merovingian history for centuries. Yet fate, or perhaps divine providence as medieval chroniclers preferred to interpret such matters, soon unified the inheritance under a single ruler whose name would become synonymous with medieval kingship itself, Charles, whom history remembers as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. The death of his brother Carloman in 771 removed the last obstacle to unified rule, and Charlemagne embraced his inheritance with the restless energy that would define his 46-year reign. Tall even by the standards of his Germanic ancestors, with flowing moustaches and eyes that contemporaries described as unusually large and animated, he possessed the physical presence that medieval people expected from their kings, combined with an intellectual curiosity that would transform the very concept of Christian rulership. His court at Aachen became the beating heart of an empire that would stretch from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. Here, in thermal springs where Romans had once bathed, Charlemagne built a palace complex that deliberately echoed the architectural grandeur of Byzantium and Rome. The palace chapel, with its soaring dome and marble columns stripped from ancient Roman buildings, declared to all who entered that a new Caesar ruled in the West. But this empire was built not through diplomatic inheritance, but through methodical conquest that consumed 3 decades of Charlemagne's life. The Saxon Wars alone required 18 separate campaigns, a grinding struggle that transformed the pagan tribes of northern Germany into subjects of the Christian Frankish king. Year after year, Charlemagne's armies crossed the Rhine in spring, fought through the summer months in the dark forests of Westphalia and Lower Saxony, and returned to Frankish territories each autumn carrying Saxon hostages and booty. The Saxon leader Widukind became the embodiment of pagan resistance, appearing and disappearing like a ghost through the birch forests and marshy lowlands, striking at Frankish garrisons and then melting away before the main army could respond. When captured, Saxons were forced to choose between baptism and death. Thousands chose the waters of conversion, only to return to their old gods when Frankish armies departed. The great massacre at Verdun in 782, where Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon nobles who had broken their baptismal oaths, demonstrated the brutal realities underlying Christian conversion. Yet when Widukind finally submitted in 785, accepting baptism with Charlemagne himself standing as godfather, the integration of Saxon territories into the Frankish realm proved remarkably successful. Saxon warriors became some of the most devoted soldiers in Charlemagne's later campaigns, while Saxon monasteries would eventually produce some of medieval Europe's most learned scholars. The conquest of Lombard Italy followed a different pattern, shaped more by papal politics than pagan resistance. When Pope Hadrian appealed for Frankish protection against Lombard pressure, Charlemagne crossed the Alps in 773 with an army that included contingents from every corner of his expanding realm. The Lombard king Desiderius, despite defensive advantages that should have made his mountain passes impregnable, found his forces outmaneuvered and his capital of Pavia under siege. The fall of Pavia in 774 made Charlemagne king of the Lombards as well as king of the Franks, ruler of territories that stretched from Frisia to Sicily. More importantly, it made him the temporal protector of the papacy, guardian of St. Peter's successor and defender of Christendom's spiritual heart. These responsibilities came to their culmination on Christmas Day in the year 800, in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, where Pope Leo III placed an imperial crown upon Charlemagne's head while the assembled congregation chanted, "Long life and victory to Charles, the most pious Augustus crowned by God, the great and peace-loving emperor of the Romans." Whether this coronation was carefully planned or genuinely surprised Charlemagne, as his biographer Einhard claimed, the ceremony marked a moment of profound historical significance. For the first time since 476, a Western emperor wore the purple. The Roman Empire, at least in theory, was restored, but Charlemagne's greatest achievement lay not in his military conquests or imperial title, but in the administrative innovations that gave his vast realm coherence and stability. From Aachen, he governed through a system of written instructions called capitularies, detailed documents that addressed everything from the proper conduct of judges to the care of royal estates, from the education of clergy to the standardization of weights and measures. The Missi Dominici, pairs of investigators comprising one secular and one ecclesiastical official, travelled throughout the empire on annual circuits, carrying imperial authority to the most remote corners of the realm. These royal envoys held courts, heard appeals, corrected abuses, and reported back to Aachen on the condition of the local administration. Through their travels, the emperor's will became reality in distant provinces, transforming theoretical authority into practical governance. The palace school at Aachen attracted scholars from across Christian Europe. Alcuin of York brought Anglo-Saxon learning, Peter of Pisa contributed classical Latin education, Theodulf of Orleans added Visigothic scholarship, while Paul the Deacon represented Lombard historical knowledge. Together, they created an intellectual environment that had not existed in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Charlemagne himself, despite never fully mastering the art of writing, possessed an insatiable curiosity about learning in all its forms. He studied grammar with Alcuin, practiced rhetoric with Peter of Pisa, and attempted to understand the mathematical calculations necessary for determining the proper date of Easter. Contemporary accounts describe him keeping writing tablets beneath his pillow, practicing letter formation during sleepless nights, though his fingers, more accustomed to sword hilts than pen shafts, never achieved the fluency he desired. This intellectual ferment at Aachen represented merely the visible peak of a cultural revival that spread throughout Charlemagne's empire, a renewal of learning and artistic achievement that modern historians have termed the Carolingian Renaissance. Unlike the Renaissance of later centuries, which looked back to classical antiquity for inspiration, this earlier revival focused primarily on recovering and preserving the Christian intellectual tradition that had flourished during the later Roman Empire. Alcuin of York, perhaps the most influential scholar in Charlemagne's circle, brought to Aachen the educational methods that had made Anglo-Saxon England the leading intellectual centre of 8th century Europe. His curriculum, based on the 7 liberal arts that had structured Roman education, divided learning into the trivium of grammar, rhetoric and dialectic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy and music. In monastery schools throughout the empire, young clerics learned to read and write using texts that range from the Psalms of David to the poetry of Virgil, from the theological treatises of Augustine to the historical works of Livy. This educational program produced a generation of scholars who could engage with both Christian and classical traditions, creating a synthesis that would dominate European intellectual life for centuries. The preservation of classical texts became a sacred duty for Carolingian scholars, who understood that the barbarian invasions and social disruptions of recent centuries had threatened the survival of ancient learning. In monastery scriptoriums from Saint-Riquier in northern France to Saint-Gall in the Alps, monks devoted their lives to copying manuscripts, their patient labour ensuring that works of literature, history, and philosophy would survive into future ages. The development of Carolingian minuscule, a standardized script that replaced the various regional writing styles used throughout the former Roman territories, revolutionized medieval book production. Clear, elegant and economical in its use of parchment, this new script made books easier to read and cheaper to produce, facilitating the spread of literacy throughout the Carolingian Empire. Artistic achievement flourished alongside scholarly activity. The palace chapel at Aachen, with its distinctive octagonal design inspired by San Vitale and Ravenna, established architectural principles that would influence church building throughout northern Europe. Illuminated manuscripts produced in Carolingian scriptoriums combined Byzantine artistic techniques with Germanic decorative traditions, creating a distinctive style that adorned gospel books, psalters, and liturgical texts with unprecedented splendour. The court workshops at Aachen produced ivory carvings, metalwork, and precious objects that demonstrated the technical sophistication of Carolingian craftsmen. The golden altar frontal created for Saint-Denis, the crystal seal rings carved for imperial use, and the magnificent gospel covers adorned with gems and precious metals all testified to an artistic renaissance that matched the intellectual achievements of the age. Poetry flourished in both Latin and vernacular languages. Theodulf of Orleans composed verses that rivaled the best classical models, while anonymous poets created the first vernacular epic, the Old High German Hildebrands Lied, which preserved Germanic heroic traditions in written form. The palace became a centre for musical innovation as well, where scholars worked to preserve and standardize the various regional traditions of liturgical chant. This cultural renewal extended far beyond the imperial court. Cathedral schools in cities like Tours, Orléans, and Reims became centres of learning that attracted students from throughout Europe. Monasteries established libraries and scriptoriums that preserved not only religious texts, but also works of classical literature, Roman law, and technical treatises on subjects ranging from agriculture to astronomy. When Charlemagne died in 814, having outlived all but one of his sons, the empire passed to Louis, whom contemporaries called the Pious for his deep religious devotion, and whom later historians would sometimes call the Debonair for his gentler approach to imperial governance. Louis inherited an empire at the height of its territorial extent and cultural achievement, but he also inherited the fundamental contradictions that would ultimately destroy Carolingian unity. Louis's reign began with efforts to reform the moral and spiritual life of the empire. Influenced by the monastic reform movement associated with Benedict of Aniene, he issued capitularies that attempted to impose stricter discipline on clergy, regulate the conduct of nobles, and establish uniform religious practices throughout his territories. Monasteries that had grown wealthy and lax during Charlemagne's reign were subjected to rigorous inspection and reform. The Synod of Aachen in 816 established standardized rules for all monasteries within the empire, while subsequent legislation attempted to separate the property and functions of secular clergy from those of regular clergy. Louis's vision of Christian empire emphasized moral renewal and spiritual unity as much as military conquest and territorial expansion. Yet this same pious emperor faced the inexorable logic of Frankish inheritance law, which demanded the division of royal property among all legitimate male heirs. The birth of his son Charles to his second wife Judith of Bavaria in 823 necessitated a revision of the earlier division plan that had awarded territories to his older sons Lothair, Louis, and Pepin. This revision sparked a series of civil wars that would devastate the empire for the remainder of Louis's reign. The rebellion of 830 saw the three older sons allied against their father, supported by a nobility that preferred the certainty of the original succession plan to the uncertainties of imperial revision. Louis was briefly deposed and forced to perform public penance for his alleged sins, a humiliation that undermined imperial authority throughout the realm. Though restored to power through the loyalty of his German supporters, Louis never fully recovered the commanding presence that effective imperial rule required. The conflicts intensified after Louis's death in 840, when his surviving sons Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald fought a three-way war for supremacy. The Battle of Fontenoy in 841, where brother fought brother while their armies shed Frankish blood across the fields of Burgundy, demonstrated the complete breakdown of the imperial unity that Charlemagne had created. The famous Strasbourg Oaths of 842, sworn by Louis the German and Charles the Bald before their assembled armies, marked another significant moment in European history. Each brother swore his oath in the language his allies' soldiers could understand. Louis spoke in Romance, the evolved Latin that would become French, while Charles spoke in Germanic, the ancestor of modern German. These oaths, recorded by the chronicler Nithard, provide the earliest written evidence of the linguistic division that would eventually separate France from Germany. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 finally ended the civil war through a three-way partition that created the basic political geography of medieval Europe. Lothair retained the imperial title along with a narrow corridor of territory stretching from the North Sea to central Italy, including Aachen and Rome. Louis the German received the eastern territories beyond the Rhine, the lands that would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire. Charles the Bald was awarded the Western Territories, the realm that would develop into medieval France. This division represented far more than a simple territorial settlement. It marked the beginning of separate French and German political development, the emergence of distinct national identities that would shape European history for centuries to come. West Francia, though initially the weakest of the three kingdoms, possessed greater internal coherence than the other divisions, setting the stage for the eventual emergence of medieval France as Europe's dominant power. The fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire coincided with a new threat that exposed the military weaknesses of divided Carolingian rule. From the fjords and islands of Scandinavia came raiders whose shallow draft longships could penetrate far up European rivers, bringing sudden destruction to monasteries, towns, and royal estates that had never faced seaborne assault. These Vikings, as contemporary chroniclers called them, possessed military advantages that Carolingian armies struggled to counter. Their ships could appear without warning at river mouths, strike at rich targets inland, and disappear downstream before local forces could respond. Their fighting techniques, developed through generations of inter-Scandinavian warfare, combined disciplined shield wall tactics with berserker ferocity that often broke the nerve of hastily assembled defenders. The first Viking raids on Frankish territories occurred during Charlemagne's later years, but the political chaos following Louis the Pious's death created opportunities that Scandinavian chieftains exploited with devastating effectiveness. The monastery of Saint-Wandrille was burned in 841, Saint-Bertin in 842, while the great abbey of Saint-Denis, burial place of Frankish kings, suffered its first raid in 845. The siege of Paris in 885–86 marked both the climax of Viking pressure and the beginning of effective Frankish resistance. Count Odo, son of Robert the Strong and ancestor of the future Capetian dynasty, commanded the defence of the fortified island that controlled river traffic along the Seine. Through a winter of desperate fighting, his garrison held the bridge towers and stone walls while Viking armies camped in the surrounding countryside. Their longships stretched along both banks of the river like a maritime siege engine. Contemporary accounts describe the daily rhythm of siege warfare, the crash of catapult stones against Parisian walls, the night sorties by Frankish warriors attempting to fire Viking ships, the gradual weakening of both sides as winter deepened into spring. When Emperor Charles the Fat finally arrived with a relief army, he chose to negotiate rather than fight, purchasing Viking withdrawal with a massive tribute payment and permission to raid Burgundian territories. This inglorious resolution of the siege highlighted the fundamental weakness of later Carolingian rule. Emperors and kings, who bore the names and titles of Charlemagne's successors, lacked both the military resources and political authority necessary to protect their subjects from external threats. The payment of tribute, or Dalngeld as it came to be known, became a regular feature of Carolingian policy, a confession of military inadequacy that encouraged further Viking adventures. Regional nobles, forced to defend their own territories without royal assistance, began to construct private fortifications and maintain personal armies. The Castellan warfare that would characterize later medieval society emerged from this necessity of local self-defense. Stone keeps arose on hilltops throughout West Francia, while wooden palisades surrounded village churches that served as refuges during Viking attacks. The rise of the Robertians, the family from which the Capetians would eventually emerge, exemplified this trend toward regionalization of authority. Robert the Strong, Odo's father, established his power through successful resistance to Viking raids in the Loire Valley, earning the loyalty of local nobility and the gratitude of the church through his military effectiveness. When Charles the Fat was deposed in 887, the Western Frankish nobles elected Odo as their king, rather than accepting another distant Carolingian relative. Though Odo's reign lasted only 10 years and Carolingian restoration followed his death, The precedent had been established. Effective rule mattered more than dynastic legitimacy. The last Carolingian kings of West Francia, Charles the Simple, Louis IV, Lothair, and Louis V ruled territories that had shrunk to little more than the original Capetian heartland around Paris and Orléans. Great duchies like Normandy, Burgundy and Aquitaine operated as virtually independent principalities, acknowledging royal suzerainty while exercising complete practical autonomy. When Louis V died childless in 987, the assembled nobles faced a choice between Charles of Lorraine, the last legitimate Carolingian claimant, and Hugh Capet, son of Hugh the Great and great-grandson of Robert the Strong. Their decision to elect Hugh Capet marked the end of the Carolingian dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter in French royal history. The coronation took place at Reims, in the same cathedral where Clovis had accepted Christian baptism nearly 5 centuries earlier. Archbishop Adalbero performed the sacred ceremony, anointing Hugh with a holy oil that legend claimed had been brought from heaven by a dove for the baptism of the first Christian Frankish king. In this moment, the sacred traditions of Frankish kingship passed from the exhausted Carolingian line to a new dynasty that would rule France for more than 3 centuries, transforming a weak federation of autonomous territories into medieval Europe's most powerful and unified kingdom. The sacred oil that touched Hugh Capet's forehead in Reims Cathedral on that July day in 987 carried with it the hopes of a nobility weary of civil war and the prayers of bishops who sought a king strong enough to protect the church yet pious enough to respect its privileges. Yet few among those witnessing the ceremony could have imagined that they were inaugurating a dynasty destined to rule France for more than 8 centuries, transforming a collection of autonomous duchies into Europe's most powerful unified kingdom. Hugh's initial position appeared precarious even by the standards of late Carolingian monarchy. His royal domain, the territory under his direct control, stretched little beyond the Ile-de-France, that fertile region between the Seine, Marne and Oise rivers, where Paris nestled on its ancient island. Beyond these narrow boundaries lay the great duchies whose dukes possessed armies larger than the king's, treasuries richer than the royal coffers, and territories more extensive than the royal lands. Duke William of Normandy commanded warriors whose grandfathers had been Viking raiders, men who combined Scandinavian tactical flexibility with Frankish heavy cavalry techniques. His duchy's coastline bristled with stone fortresses, while Norman monasteries had become centres of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe. Duke Richard of Burgundy controlled the prosperous trade routes between northern and southern Europe, his authority extending from the Seine to the Saône, encompassing some of the richest vineyard country in Christendom. In the south, Duke William of Aquitaine ruled territories larger than many kingdoms, stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic coast to the highlands of the Massif Central. His court at Poitiers had become a centre of troubadour culture, where poets composed verses in the emerging vernacular languages that would eventually mature into French and Occitan literature. Yet Hugh possessed advantages that his more powerful vassals lacked. His election by the assembled nobility gave him legitimacy that no regional duke could claim. His coronation and anointing by the Archbishop of Reims connected him to the sacred traditions of Frankish kingship that stretched back to Clovis and Charlemagne. Most importantly, his central position between the great duchies allowed him to play the role of arbiter and mediator, preventing any single duchy from dominating the others. Hugh's reign, lasting only 9 years until his death in 996, established patterns of Capetian governance that would persist for generations. Rather than attempting the kind of military conquest that had characterized Carolingian expansion, he focused on careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and patient accumulation of rights and privileges within his own domain. His alliance with the reformed monasteries, particularly the influential Abbey of Saint-Denis, provided both spiritual legitimacy and practical administrative support. The most crucial decision of Hugh's reign proved to be the association of his son Robert as co-ruler during his own lifetime, a precedent that would ensure smooth Capetian succession for nearly 2 centuries. When Hugh died in 996, Robert II, called the Pious, ascended to the throne without challenge, opposition, or the civil wars that had plagued every Carolingian succession. Robert's 31-year reign witnessed the gradual strengthening of royal authority within the Ile-de-France and the beginning of systematic royal administration. Contemporary chronicles describe a king who could read and write, who composed Latin hymns for liturgical use, who established hospitals and founded churches, yet who also possessed the political acumen necessary to maintain royal authority against ambitious vassals. The reign of Henry thus, from 1031 to 1060, continued this patient work of royal consolidation. His marriage to Anne of Kiev, daughter of the Russian Prince Yaroslav the Wise, demonstrated the growing international recognition of Capetian legitimacy. This exotic princess, who brought to the French court knowledge of Byzantine customs and orthodox religious practices, fascinated contemporary chroniclers who described her intelligence, beauty, and the strange script in which she wrote her native language. Throughout these early Capetian reigns, the kings faced the constant challenge of asserting authority over powerful vassals, while avoiding the kind of confrontations that might unite the great dukes against royal power. They learned to use marriage alliances, church support, and careful legal maneuvering rather than military force, establishing diplomatic traditions that would serve their successors well in more favourable circumstances. During these same decades, the social and political structure of Western Europe was undergoing a fundamental transformation that historians have termed the feudal revolution. The personal relationships of loyalty and service that had always characterized warrior societies were becoming formalized into legal institutions, creating a complex web of obligations that bound together everyone from peasant farmers to great dukes in a hierarchy of mutual dependence. The development of vassalage transformed the relationship between rulers and warriors from temporary military service based on kinship or personal friendship into permanent bonds sealed by sacred oaths and reinforced by land grants called fiefs. A vassal who knelt before his lord, placed his hands between the lord's hands, and swore the oath of homage was entering into a contract that defined his military obligations, his judicial duties, and his social position within the emerging feudal hierarchy. The ceremony of investiture, in which the lord granted his vassal a fief in exchange for military service, created a new form of landholding that combined Germanic traditions of personal loyalty with Roman concepts of property rights. The vassal received not merely temporary use of land, as earlier warriors had enjoyed, but heritable tenure that could be passed to his sons, provided they were willing and able to fulfill the military obligations that accompanied the grant. This system reached its fullest development in the construction of castles, those stone monuments to feudal authority that began to dot the landscape of France during the 11th century. The great keeps that rose on hilltops and river bends served multiple functions: military strongholds that could withstand siege warfare, administrative centres where lords held court and dispensed justice, economic hubs that controlled local trade routes, and symbols of noble power that dominated the surrounding countryside. The castle of Loches, rising on its rocky promontory above the Indre Valley, exemplified this architectural revolution. Its massive donjon, built in the early 11th century, stood nearly 100 feet high, its thick walls containing chambers where lords lived, worked, and entertained guests. The great hall, with its soaring ceiling and enormous fireplace, could accommodate the entire household for communal meals, legal proceedings, and ceremonial occasions. Similar fortifications appeared throughout France as regional nobles constructed private strongholds that reflected both the fragmentation of political authority and the increasing sophistication of military architecture. The Counts of Anjou built a chain of castles along the Loire Valley, each positioned to control river crossings and trade routes. The Dukes of Normandy fortified their frontier with massive stone keeps at Falaise, Caen, and Rouen, creating defensive networks that could protect the duchy from external invasion while maintaining internal order. This castle building transformed not only the military landscape but also the economic and social structures of medieval France. Each castle became the centre of a local economy based on agricultural production, craft specialisation, and commercial exchange. Peasant farmers brought their grain to be ground in mills powered by streams diverted through castle courtyards. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and stonemasons found steady employment maintaining and expanding fortifications. Weekly markets in castle baileys attracted merchants from distant towns, creating networks of trade that gradually revived economic life throughout the countryside. The great duchies that had emerged from the fragmentation of Carolingian authority developed their own distinctive characteristics during this period. Normandy, under its succession of able dukes, became known for administrative efficiency, military innovation, and cultural achievement. Norman knights perfected heavy cavalry tactics that would prove decisive in future conflicts, while Norman monasteries became centres of historical writing and theological scholarship. Burgundy developed into one of Europe's most prosperous regions, its strategic position controlling trade routes between the Mediterranean and the North Sea, generating wealth that funded magnificent churches, supported scholarly activities, and attracted craftsmen whose skills in metalwork, sculpture, and manuscript illumination became legendary throughout Christendom. Aquitaine, with its warm climate and rich agricultural lands, fostered a distinctive courtly culture that emphasized literary achievement, musical sophistication, and refined social customs. The troubadours who emerged from Aquitanian courts would eventually influence literary development throughout Europe, their songs and poems celebrating ideals of courtly love that would become central to medieval aristocratic culture. Parallel to these political and social transformations, the 11th century witnessed a remarkable renewal of religious life that touched every aspect of medieval society. The monastic reform movement that had begun at Cluny in Burgundy during the previous century spread throughout France, establishing new standards of religious observance while creating networks of reformed monasteries that transcended political boundaries. The Abbey of Cluny itself became the mother house of a monastic empire that eventually encompassed more than 1,000 religious communities stretching from Scotland to Spain, from Poland to Portugal. Under the leadership of abbots like Odilo and Hugh, Cluny developed new forms of liturgical celebration that emphasized the beauty and solemnity of divine worship. The daily round of prayers, beginning with matins before dawn and continuing through Compline after sunset, created a rhythm of religious observance that sanctified every hour of the monastic day. Cluniac monasteries became centres of artistic achievement as well as religious devotion. Their churches, built on a scale that rivaled cathedrals, featured architectural innovations that would influence ecclesiastical building throughout Europe. The Great Abbey Church at Cluny, begun in the late 11th century, stretched nearly 600 feet in length, its soaring nave supported by pointed arches that anticipated later Gothic developments. The Reform movement extended beyond monasteries to encompass the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Gregorian Reform, named for Pope Gregory VII, attempted to free the Church from lay control while establishing higher standards of clerical conduct. The requirement of clerical celibacy, fiercely resisted by many clergy who had lived for generations as married men, gradually became accepted practice throughout the French Church. The investiture controversy, the conflict between papal and royal authority over the appointment of bishops and abbots, reached France during the reign of Philip Durand, creating tensions between royal prerogatives and ecclesiastical independence that would persist for centuries. French kings, unlike their German counterparts, generally avoided direct confrontation with papal authority, preferring negotiated settlements that preserved royal influence while acknowledging church autonomy in spiritual matters. This religious renewal contributed to the emergence of crusading ideology, the concept that military force could serve divine purposes when directed against the enemies of Christendom. Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095 found enthusiastic response among French nobles, who saw in holy war an opportunity to serve God while seeking earthly glory and territorial gain. The response to Urban's preaching demonstrated the deep religiosity that characterized 11th century French society. Nobles who had spent their lives in private warfare against neighbouring lords now united under the banner of the cross, their feudal obligations temporarily set aside in service of a higher cause. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres described the scene at Clermont. When Pope Urban had said these and many other things in his urbane discourse, He so influenced to one purpose the desires of all who were present that they cried out, "It is the will of God! It is the will of God!" The departure of the crusading armies in 1096 temporarily depopulated many regions of France of their military nobility, creating opportunities for royal authority to expand while also establishing precedents for future cooperation between French nobles and the papacy. The success of the First Crusade, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, enhanced the prestige of French knighthood throughout Europe, while creating lasting connections between France and the Crusade estates of the Eastern Mediterranean. The intellectual revival that accompanied religious reform found expression in the establishment of cathedral schools that would eventually evolve into medieval universities. The school at Chartres became famous throughout Europe for its teaching of classical literature and mathematical sciences, while the School of Notre Dame in Paris emerged as a centre of theological study that attracted students from every corner of Christendom. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1108, he inherited a kingdom where royal authority remained largely theoretical beyond the boundaries of the Ile-de-France. Yet this king, whom contemporaries called Louis the Fat for his considerable girth, possessed the energy and determination necessary to transform Capetian monarchy from ceremonial overlordship into effective political power. Louis's early reign was consumed by the methodical suppression of Castellan warfare within the royal domain. Local lords who had constructed unauthorized fortifications, imposed illegal tolls on merchants, or defied royal justice found themselves facing the full weight of royal military power. The siege and destruction of Le Puisay in 1111 demonstrated that the Capetian king possessed both the resources and the resolve to enforce his authority against rebellious vassals. Campaign by campaign, Louis eliminated the independent strongholds that had fragmented royal authority within his own lands. The capture of Crécy, the destruction of Livry, the siege of La Ferté-Alais all contributed to the pacification of the Ile-de-France, creating a zone of royal peace that attracted merchants, pilgrims and settlers seeking security in an age of endemic violence. The king's alliance with Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis proved crucial to this process of royal consolidation. Suger, one of the most remarkable figures of the 12th century, combined deep religious devotion with sophisticated political understanding and innovative administrative techniques. His biography of Louis XVI provides intimate glimpses of royal life while documenting the systematic expansion of royal authority. Under Suger's influence, Louis developed new forms of royal administration that extended effective governance throughout his domains. Royal officials, called prévôts, collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained order in the king's name, creating bureaucratic structures that would eventually encompass all of France. The royal court, which had been merely the king's travelling household, began to develop specialised departments for finance, justice, and military affairs. Louis's greatest challenge came from the ambitions of Henry VI of England, who also held the Norman duchy as a vassal of the French crown. The complex relationship between the English king and his French overlord created diplomatic and military tensions that would persist for centuries, as Henry sought to expand Norman territories in France, while Louis attempted to contain English influence and maintain the traditional boundaries between the duchies. The marriage of Louis's son, the future Louis VII, to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1137, represented the high point of early Capetian diplomatic success. This union brought the vast Duchy of Aquitaine under royal influence, theoretically doubling the territories under Capetian control and creating the possibility of genuine royal authority throughout much of France. Eleanor, heiress to the largest and wealthiest duchy in France, brought to the royal court not only extensive territories, but also the sophisticated culture of southern France. Her retinue included troubadours, scholars, and courtiers who introduced northern France to the literary and artistic achievements of Aquitanian civilization. Contemporary chroniclers described her beauty, intelligence, and strong personality, noting that she possessed education and political acumen unusual even among noble women of the age. Louis VII's reign, beginning in 1137, initially seemed to promise the realization of Capetian territorial ambitions. Yet the young king's decision to participate in the Second Crusade proved fateful for both his personal life and his dynasty's future. The Second Crusade proved a military disaster, its armies decimated by Turkish forces in Anatolia before reaching the Crusader states of Syria and Palestine. More significantly for French history, the prolonged campaign created tensions between Louis and Eleanor that would eventually destroy their marriage. Contemporary accounts suggest that Eleanor's conduct during the Crusade, particularly her relationship with her uncle Raymond of Antioch, aroused Louis's suspicions and permanently damaged their relationship. The annulment of Louis and Eleanor's marriage in 1152, ostensibly on grounds of consanguinity, but actually resulting from their incompatibility, and Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir, proved to be one of the most consequential diplomatic failures in Capetian history. Eleanor's subsequent marriage to Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, created the Angevin Empire that would dominate western France for the next half-century. When Henry became King of England in 1154, he ruled territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, holding more French land as vassal than Louis XI possessed as king. This reversal of fortune demonstrated the continuing limitations of Capetian power, while setting the stage for the great confrontations of the following century between Plantagenet ambition and Capetian determination to establish genuine royal authority throughout France. Yet even this setback contributed to the long-term strengthening of royal administration. Louis VII's advisers, recognizing that the Capetians could not compete with Plantagenet resources through military force alone, began developing more sophisticated governmental techniques. The royal chancery became more efficient at producing and preserving documents, creating administrative records that would prove invaluable to future kings. The development of royal justice, offering alternatives to feudal courts, began to attract litigants from throughout France, gradually extending royal influence through legal rather than military means. When Philip Augustus ascended the throne in 1180 at the age of 15, he inherited a kingdom still overshadowed by the vast Plantagenet domains that stretched across western France. Yet this young king possessed qualities that would transform the Capetian monarchy from regional overlordship into the dominant power of medieval Europe, a calculating intelligence that could perceive opportunity within apparent disadvantage, a patient determination that could pursue long-term strategies through decades of careful maneuvering, and an administrative genius that would create the governmental structures of medieval France. The Plantagenet Empire that confronted Philip represented both the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity in Capetian history. Henry II of England ruled territories from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, commanding resources that dwarfed those of the French king, while holding most of these lands as Philip's feudal vassal. This contradiction between theoretical overlordship and practical powerlessness created the diplomatic and military tensions that would define Philip's reign. The death of Henry II in 1189 and the succession of his son Richard, called the Lionheart, initially seemed to strengthen the Plantagenet position. Richard possessed a military reputation that made him legendary even in his own lifetime, a crusading fervour that had earned him respect throughout Christendom, and personal charisma that commanded the loyalty of knights from England to Aquitaine. Yet Richard's very strength contained the seeds of Plantagenet weakness, for his obsession with crusading glory and military adventure diverted attention and resources from the patient work of territorial administration. Philip's participation in the Third Crusade demonstrated his political acumen as much as his religious devotion, while Richard threw himself into the military campaign with characteristic intensity, besieging Acre and marching toward Jerusalem with single-minded determination. Philip calculated the costs and benefits of prolonged absence from France. When fever struck the crusading army and political necessity demanded attention to domestic affairs, Philip returned to France while Richard continued his eastern adventures. The years of Richard's absence, prolonged by his capture and imprisonment during the return journey, provided Philip with unprecedented opportunities to expand royal authority. Using his legal rights as feudal overlord, Philip confiscated territories from vassals who had violated their obligations, supported local nobles who opposed Plantagenet authority, and gradually extended direct royal control over strategic fortifications and commercial centres. The construction of fortresses at key points throughout the Île-de-France and adjacent territories demonstrated Philip's understanding that military architecture could be as important as diplomatic manoeuvring in establishing royal authority. The great fortress of Gisors, controlling the frontier between Normandy and the royal domain, became a symbol of this methodical expansion, its massive keep and concentric defences representing the new sophistication of royal military engineering. When Richard returned from Crusade in 1194, he found a fundamentally altered strategic situation. Philip had not only expanded royal territories, but had also created administrative systems that made these conquests permanent rather than temporary. The appointment of bailli, royal officials who combined judicial, financial and military authority within their jurisdictions, extended effective royal governance throughout the expanded domain. The wars between Philip and Richard that consumed the final years of the 12th century established patterns of conflict that would persist for decades. Castle sieges replaced open field battles as the primary form of military activity, with engineers and sappers becoming as important as knights and archers. The fortress of Château Gaillard, Richard's saucy castle overlooking the Seine Valley, represented the pinnacle of defensive architecture, its innovative design incorporating lessons learned from crusading warfare in the East. Richard's death in 1199 from a crossbow bolt received while besieging a rebellious castle fundamentally altered the balance of power between Capetian and Plantagenet. John Lackland, Richard's successor, possessed neither his brother's military reputation nor his personal charisma, while his nephew Arthur of Brittany claimed superior hereditary rights to the Plantagenet succession. Philip exploited this succession crisis with characteristic patience and cunning. By supporting Arthur's claims while negotiating with John, by offering legal arbitration while preparing military campaigns, by presenting himself as the defender of feudal law while pursuing territorial aggrandizement, Philip created the conditions for Plantagenet collapse. The mysterious disappearance of Arthur of Brittany in 1203, widely attributed to John's direct involvement, provided Philip with the legal justification he needed for wholesale confiscation of Plantagenet territories. As feudal overlord, Philip could legitimately declare John's fiefs forfeit for the murder of his vassal, transforming what had been private warfare into judicial proceedings that carried the weight of established law. The conquest of Normandy between 1203 and 1204 proceeded with remarkable speed once Philip committed his full resources to the campaign. Château Gaillard, supposedly impregnable, fell to French forces after a siege that demonstrated the growing sophistication of medieval siege warfare. One by one, Norman castles opened their gates to French troops, their garrisons more willing to serve the victorious French king than the increasingly desperate English ruler. The capture of Rouen in 1204 completed the conquest of Normandy, ending 3 centuries of Anglo-Norman rule and integrating the duchy permanently into the French royal domain. The integration proved remarkably smooth, with Norman nobles accepting French overlordship while retaining their local privileges, Norman administrative practices being adapted to French governmental needs, and Norman cultural traditions contributing to the emerging synthesis of French civilization. Philip's administrative revolution extended far beyond territorial conquest to encompass fundamental changes in royal governance. The bailli who administered conquered territories developed new techniques of financial management, judicial procedure, and military organization that would eventually be applied throughout the French kingdom. Written records replaced oral tradition in royal administration, creating archives that preserved legal precedents, financial accounts, and administrative correspondence. The rebuilding of Paris during Philip's reign symbolized the transformation of Capetian monarchy from regional principality to European power. The walls that Philip constructed around the expanding city enclosed not only the original island settlement, but also the growing commercial districts on both banks of the Seine. The fortress of the Louvre, begun in 1200, served as both royal residence and defensive stronghold, its massive towers dominating the western approaches to the city. These Parisian walls stretched for more than 3 miles, encompassing vineyards and gardens that ensured food supplies during siege, while the gates that controlled access to the city became centres of commercial activity where merchants from throughout Europe gathered to trade in French textiles, wines, and manufactured goods. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214 marked the climax of Philip's struggle against the coalition that had formed to contain French expansion. Emperor Otto Thor, King John of England, and Count Ferrand of Flanders united their forces in a massive army designed to crush French power through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Yet Philip's patient diplomacy had secured alliances with Frederick II of Germany and Pope Innocent III, ensuring that the coalition faced French power at its peak rather than at its moment of weakness. On the plains of Bouvines, near the modern border between France and Belgium, Philip commanded an army that represented the full flower of French military development. Knights from the royal domain fought beside nobles from newly conquered territories, their heavy cavalry supported by infantry levies drawn from the growing towns of northern France. The royal standard, the Oriflamme of Saint-Denis, flew above formations that included contingents from every corner of the expanding French kingdom. The battle itself lasted only a few hours on that July afternoon, but its consequences echoed through the remainder of the medieval period. The capture of Count Ferrand and the flight of Emperor Otto established French hegemony over the Low Countries, while confirming the conquest of Normandy and Anjou. King John's absence from the battlefield, necessitated by revolts in England, demonstrated the fatal weakness of divided Plantagenet resources. Philip's triumphal return to Paris after Bouvines witnessed celebrations that contemporary chroniclers described as unprecedented in their scale and enthusiasm. Citizens lined the streets as the king's procession made its way from the gates to Notre Dame Cathedral, where Te Deum was sung in thanksgiving for divine favour. The captured standards of enemy armies were displayed as trophies of French victory, while the prisoners taken at Bouvines were paraded as evidence of royal triumph. The brief reign of Louis VIII, lasting only 3 years from 1223 to 1226, marked a crucial transition in Capetian policy from northern consolidation to southern expansion. This king, whom contemporaries called Louis the Lion for his courage in battle, inherited from his father Philip Augustus a kingdom transformed in resources, administration, and military capability, yet still confined largely to northern France, while the vast territories of Languedoc remained independent of royal authority. The Albigensian Crusade, begun in 1209 under papal auspices to suppress the Cathar heresy that flourished in southern France, had devastated the political structure of Languedoc without establishing lasting authority over its territories. The brutal campaigns led by Simon de Montfort had destroyed the power of traditional noble families like the Counts of Toulouse, while creating a power vacuum that invited royal intervention. Louis's decision to assume leadership of the Albigensian Crusade represented both religious conviction and political calculation. As a pious Catholic king, he felt genuine concern for the suppression of heresy that papal legates described as threatening the foundations of Christian civilization. As a practical politician, he recognized that crusading ideology provided legal and moral justification for territorial expansion that might otherwise be condemned as mere aggression. The expedition that Louis led into Languedoc in 1226 differed fundamentally from earlier crusading armies. Rather than the loosely organized bands of volunteers that had characterized previous campaigns, Louis commanded a royal army equipped with siege engines, supported by professional administrators and financed through systematic taxation that demonstrated the growing fiscal capabilities of Capetian government. City after city opened its gates to the advancing royal army, their submissions sealed by ceremonies that emphasized both military conquest and legitimate succession to previous authority. At Avignon, the magnificent bridge across the Rhône became the symbol of royal triumph when the city's walls were systematically demolished to prevent future resistance. At Nimes and Carcassonne, royal garrisons replaced local noble authorities while royal officials began the process of integrating southern territories into northern administrative systems. The death of Louis VIII at Montpensier in November 1226, apparently from dysentery contracted during the campaign, created a succession crisis that threatened to undo the territorial gains of the previous half-century. His heir, the future Louis IX, was only 12 years old, while the great nobles who had submitted to royal authority during the conquests of Philip Augustus and Louis V began to reconsider their allegiances in light of changed circumstances. Yet the regency established under Queen Blanche of Castile proved remarkably effective in maintaining royal authority during this vulnerable period. Blanche, daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile and granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, possessed both the political acumen necessary to navigate the complex relationships between crown and nobility and the administrative skills required to maintain the governmental systems developed by her predecessors. The minority of Louis IX under his mother's regency witnessed the consolidation of territorial gains made during the previous generation while establishing new patterns of royal governance that would define medieval French monarchy. Blanche of Castile proved to be one of the most capable rulers in Capetian history, combining diplomatic finesse with administrative efficiency and, when necessary, military determination that rivaled that of her male predecessors. The rebellions that erupted throughout France during the early years of the minority tested both the loyalty of recently conquered territories and the effectiveness of royal administrative systems. Great nobles like Hugh of Lusignan and Peter Mauclerc of Brittany, supported by King Henry III of England, attempted to reverse the territorial losses suffered during Philip Augustus's reign by exploiting what they perceived as royal weakness during a minority government. Yet Blanche's response to these challenges demonstrated the fundamental transformation that had occurred in royal resources and capabilities. Rather than relying primarily on feudal levies that might prove unreliable in extended campaigns, the Regency government employed professional troops paid from royal revenues and supported by siege equipment maintained in royal arsenals. The systematic reduction of rebel strongholds throughout 1227 and 1228 proved that effective royal power no longer depended solely on the personal presence and charisma of adult male kings. The integration of Languedoc continued during the Regency through administrative policies that balanced respect for local customs with establishment of royal authority. The seneschals appointed to govern southern territories were often drawn from northern French nobility, ensuring their loyalty to the crown, while local administrators who had served previous rulers were retained when they demonstrated competence and reliability. When Louis IX assumed personal rule in 1234 at the age of 20, he inherited a kingdom whose territorial extent and governmental sophistication far exceeded anything achieved by previous Capetian monarchs. Yet Louis's reign would be remembered not primarily for territorial expansion or administrative innovation, but for the moral and spiritual qualities that would eventually earn him canonization as Saint Louis, the ideal of Christian kingship. Contemporary accounts describe a king of remarkable physical presence and moral authority. Tall and slender, with fair hair that he wore in the fashion of his ancestors, Louis possessed a dignity and gravitas that impressed even foreign ambassadors accustomed to the elaborate ceremonials of Byzantine and Islamic courts. His personal piety, demonstrated through daily attendance at multiple masses, regular confession, and generous almsgiving, established new standards for royal conduct while reinforcing the sacred character of French monarchy. The legal reforms associated with Louis's reign transformed royal justice from an administrative convenience into a moral imperative that attracted litigants from throughout France and beyond. The Parliament of Paris, originally the King's Court sitting in judicial session, developed into a permanent institution staffed by trained jurists who applied increasingly sophisticated legal principles to disputes brought before royal jurisdiction. Louis's personal involvement in judicial proceedings, symbolized by the legend of the king dispensing justice beneath an oak tree at Vincennes, reflected his conviction that royal authority derived ultimately from divine mandate to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Contemporary chroniclers describe sessions where the king listened patiently to complaints from peasants and merchants, nobles and clerics, ensuring that royal justice was accessible to all subjects regardless of social status. The Seventh Crusade, launched in 1248 under Louis's personal leadership, demonstrated both the continuing power of crusading ideology and the growing resources available to French monarchy. The expedition that sailed from Aigues-Mortes included contingents from throughout France, supported by a fleet built in Mediterranean ports specifically for the campaign, and financed through taxation that reached into every corner of the kingdom. The initial success of the crusade, marked by the capture of Damietta at the mouth of the Nile, seemed to vindicate Louis's conviction that divine favour would reward pious intentions and careful preparation. Yet the subsequent defeat at Mansoura and Louis's capture by Egyptian forces revealed the limitations of crusading warfare when confronted by sophisticated Muslim military tactics and the hostile environment of the Nile Delta. Louis's captivity in Egypt, lasting several months while ransom negotiations proceeded, became a defining moment in his spiritual development and his conception of royal duty. Contemporary accounts describe a king who maintained his dignity and faith despite the humiliation of defeat, who cared for his sick and wounded followers despite his own captivity, and who emerged from the experience with an even deeper commitment to Christian principles of justice and mercy. The architectural patronage that characterized Louis's reign found its supreme expression in the Sainte-Chapelle, built to house the crown of thorns and other relics acquired from the bankrupt Latin Empire of Constantinople. This jewel of Gothic architecture, with its soaring walls of stained glass that transformed the chapel interior into a symphony of coloured light, represented both the artistic achievement of 13th century France and the religious devotion of its saintly king. The windows of Sainte-Chapelle, rising nearly 70 feet from floor to vault, depicted biblical and historical scenes that educated viewers while inspiring devotion. The story of creation, the lives of the patriarchs, the history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the passion of Christ, and the acquisition of the sacred relics all found expression in glass that contemporaries compared to precious gems set in stone. The economic prosperity that characterized Louis's reign reflected the stability created by effective royal governance and the expansion of commercial networks that connected French markets with trading centres throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The fairs of Champagne became international meeting places where merchants from Italy traded with counterparts from Flanders, where silver from German mines purchased spices from the East, where French wines and textiles found markets from London to Constantinople. Urban growth accelerated throughout the kingdom as towns expanded beyond their original walls and new settlements appeared at strategic locations along trade routes. Paris itself became one of Europe's largest cities, its population approaching 200,000 inhabitants, who lived in houses that crowded along narrow streets radiating from the central island where Notre Dame Cathedral rose in Gothic splendour. The cultural achievements of 13th century France reflected the convergence of religious devotion, intellectual curiosity, artistic innovation, and economic prosperity that marked the high point of medieval civilization. The Gothic style that emerged from the rebuilding of Saint-Denis under Abbot Suger during the previous century reached its full development in the great cathedrals that rose throughout Louis IX's kingdom, their soaring spires and luminous interiors expressing both technical mastery and spiritual aspiration. Notre Dame of Paris, begun in 1163 under Bishop Maurice de Sully, embodied the ambitions and achievements of 13th century Gothic architecture. Its facade, with its 3 portals depicting the Last Judgment, the life of the Virgin, and the story of St. Anne, served as a stone encyclopedia that educated viewers in Christian history and doctrine. The rose windows that illuminated the transepts filtered sunlight into patterns of coloured brilliance that contemporary observers compared to visions of paradise. The Cathedral of Chartres, rebuilt after a fire in 1194, demonstrated the sophisticated engineering techniques that made Gothic architecture possible. Its flying buttresses, those graceful arcs of stone that supported the soaring nave walls, allowed architects to create interior spaces filled with light while maintaining structural integrity. The labyrinth set into the floor of the nave provided pilgrims with a symbolic journey to Jerusalem, its winding path representing the spiritual struggles required for salvation. At Reims, where French kings were crowned, the cathedral rebuilding that began in 1211 created a setting worthy of the sacred ceremonies that legitimized royal authority. The gallery of kings that adorned the western facade included not only biblical monarchs, but also Clovis and other Christian rulers who had established the traditions of French kingship. The great rose window that illuminated the royal ceremonies filtered light through scenes that connected earthly monarchy with divine authority. The intellectual ferment that accompanied architectural achievement found its centre in the University of Paris, where scholars from throughout Europe gathered to study theology, philosophy, law, and the liberal arts. The left bank of the Seine became the intellectual heart of medieval Europe, its narrow streets filled with students and masters debating questions that range from the nature of divine knowledge to the proper interpretation of Aristotelian philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar whose Summa Theologica would become the foundation of medieval scholastic thought, taught in Paris during the 1260s, creating a synthesis of Christian revelation and classical philosophy that resolved apparent contradictions between faith and reason. His systematic treatment of theological questions using methods derived from Aristotelian logic established intellectual frameworks that would influence European thought for centuries. The emergence of vernacular literature during this period reflected the cultural confidence of a civilization that no longer felt compelled to express all sophisticated thought in Latin. The Arthurian romances composed by Chrétien de Troyes created literary models that influenced storytelling throughout Europe. Their tales of knights and ladies, quests and adventures, courtly love and chivalric honour providing entertainment while exploring moral and social questions. The Song of Roland, celebrating the heroic death of Charlemagne's nephew at the hands of Saracen warriors, became the first great epic of French literature, its verses recited in castle halls and market squares throughout the kingdom. The idealization of feudal loyalty and Christian courage that characterized the poem reflected both historical memory and contemporary values, creating a literary tradition that would inspire French authors for generations. The agricultural revolution that supported this cultural flowering involved both technological innovations and organizational changes that increased productivity throughout rural France. The heavy plough, capable of turning the dense soils of northern Europe, made possible the cultivation of previously marginal lands. The three-field system, rotating crops to maintain soil fertility while maximizing production, supported larger populations while providing surpluses for urban markets. Watermills and windmills appeared throughout the countryside, their mechanical power applied not only to grain grinding but also to textile production, metalworking, and other crafts that supplied growing urban markets. The horse collar, which allowed more efficient use of animal power, revolutionized agricultural work while facilitating the expansion of trade networks that connected local markets with regional and international commerce. The demographic expansion that characterized the 13th century saw France's population reach levels that would not be exceeded until the 18th century. New villages appeared in forest clearings, while established settlements expanded beyond their original boundaries. The countryside filled with people who lived in conditions that, while remaining difficult by modern standards, represented improvements over earlier medieval circumstances. This period of cultural synthesis and demographic growth established France as the dominant civilization of medieval Europe, a position it would maintain despite the challenges and crises that would mark the following centuries. The achievements of the age of Louis IX, preserved in stone cathedrals and manuscript illuminations, in legal codes and administrative records, in literary works and theological treatises, created a cultural foundation that would influence European development throughout the remainder of the medieval period and beyond. The death of Louis IX in 1270, while on crusade in Tunisia, marked not only the end of a remarkable reign, but the close of an era when French monarchy could draw upon the moral authority of undisputed sanctity. His successor, Philip III, called the Bold, ruled for only 15 years before his own death in 1285, passed the crown to a king whose methods would be as ruthless as his ambitions were grand. Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair for his striking physical beauty, yet remembered by posterity for political innovations that would fundamentally transform the relationship between monarchy and society in medieval France. Philip inherited a kingdom at the height of its territorial extent and cultural achievement, Yet he also inherited the financial burdens that accompanied such greatness. The crusades of his predecessor, the magnificent architectural projects that adorned French cities, the elaborate court ceremonies that proclaimed royal dignity, and the expanding bureaucratic apparatus that governed an increasingly complex realm, all demanded revenues that traditional feudal obligations could no longer provide. Philip's reign would be defined by his systematic efforts to extract these necessary resources from every available source, regardless of traditional privileges or established customs. The conflict that would define Philip's relationship with the Church began seemingly as a technical dispute over clerical taxation, but evolved into a fundamental confrontation over the nature of royal authority itself. When Pope Boniface VIII issued the bull Clericis Laicos in 1296, forbidding secular rulers from taxing clergy without papal permission, Philip responded with characteristic directness. He prohibited the export of gold and silver from France, effectively cutting off papal revenues from French sources while demonstrating that royal power could match ecclesiastical authority in practical terms. The escalation of this conflict revealed both Philip's political genius and his willingness to employ methods that would have shocked his saintly predecessor. The Estates General, summoned for the first time in French history in 1302, provided Philip with a forum for demonstrating that his policies enjoyed popular support while establishing precedents for royal consultation with representatives of the three estates, nobility, clergy, and common people. This assembly, meeting in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, heard royal justification for policies that presented the king as defender of French interests against foreign interference, whether papal or imperial. Yet Philip's most dramatic confrontation with papal authority occurred not in formal assemblies, but in the dramatic events at Anagni in 1303, where royal agents, led by Guillaume de Nogaret, arrested Pope Boniface VIII in his own palace. Though Boniface died shortly afterward, and his immediate successor reigned for only 8 months, the symbolic impact of this unprecedented humiliation of papal dignity echoed throughout Christendom. When Philip secured the election of Clement Auvergne, a Frenchman, as Pope in 1305, and the subsequent establishment of the papal court at Avignon in 1309, French monarchy had achieved effective control over the institutional leadership of Western Christianity. The suppression of the Knights Templar between 1307 and 1312 demonstrated Philip's mastery of the techniques of political manipulation on an international scale. The charges brought against the Templars' heresy, sodomy, and blasphemous ritual practices provided moral justification for the seizure of the order's vast wealth, while eliminating a potential rival to royal authority. The coordinated arrests throughout France on Friday, October 13, 1307, showed the efficiency of royal administration, while the confessions extracted through torture and the spectacular public burning of Grandmaster Jacques de Molay in 1314 provided dramatic confirmation of royal justice in action. Contemporary chroniclers describe the scene at the Île aux Juifs in Paris, where Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay, the last leaders of the Templar order, were burned alive before crowds that included members of the royal court and ecclesiastical dignitaries. As the flames rose around the condemned men, Molay reportedly called upon both Pope Clement VI and King Philip to join him, before God's judgment within the year. The deaths of both Pope and King in 1314, within months of Molay's execution, provided medieval chroniclers with evidence of divine justice, while modern historians recognize the sophisticated propaganda campaign that accompanied the Templar suppression. The administrative innovations of Philip's reign extended far beyond these dramatic confrontations to encompass systematic reforms that strengthened royal authority at every level of French society. The expansion of the Parlement of Paris transformed what had been the king's occasional judicial court into a permanent institution staffed by professional judges who applied increasingly sophisticated legal principles throughout the kingdom. The development of the Chambre des Comptes created systematic financial administration that could track royal revenues and expenditures with unprecedented precision. The establishment of royal bailey and seneschals throughout the kingdom extended direct royal administration into regions that had traditionally governed themselves through local custom and noble privilege. These royal officials, drawn from the emerging class of university-trained lawyers rather than hereditary nobles, owed their positions entirely to royal favour and implemented royal policies with professional competence rather than feudal loyalty. Philip's monetary policies demonstrated his understanding that economic control could be as effective as military force in establishing royal supremacy. The systematic debasement of silver currency, while providing immediate financial relief to the royal treasury, also created inflation that affected every economic transaction throughout the kingdom. The expulsion of Jews from France in 1306, following the seizure of their financial assets, eliminated competitors to royal money lending while providing resources for immediate royal needs. The establishment of the Estates General as a regular though infrequent institution of royal government represented Philip's recognition that effective absolutism required at least the appearance of consultation with his subjects. These assemblies, bringing together representatives from throughout France, served multiple purposes. They provided forums for explaining royal policies, they demonstrated popular support for royal initiatives, and they created mechanisms for extraordinary taxation that could supplement traditional feudal revenues. The reign of Louis I, Philip the Fair's eldest son, began in 1314 with the kingdom at the peak of its administrative sophistication and territorial integration, yet within a year France would face natural disasters that tested every aspect of royal authority, while revealing the fundamental vulnerability of medieval civilization to climatic change. The Great Famine that devastated northern Europe between 1315 and 1322 marked the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of climatic conditions that would challenge European society for generations to come. The crisis began with the autumn rains of 1314, which continued with unprecedented intensity through the winter and into the following spring. Contemporary chronicles describe rainfall so heavy that castle walls collapsed under the weight of water, that roads became impassable rivers of mud, and that fields intended for spring planting lay under standing water well into the summer months. The monk of Malmesbury recorded that floods of rain have rotted almost all the seed, so that the prophecy of Isaiah might seem now to be fulfilled. For he says that 10 acres of vineyard shall yield 1 little measure, and 30 bushels of seed shall yield 3 bushels. The agricultural catastrophe that followed this climatic disruption exposed the precarious balance between population and resources that characterized early 14th century Europe. 3 centuries of demographic growth, supported by agricultural expansion and technological innovation, had brought European population to levels that could be sustained only under favorable climatic conditions. When those conditions changed, the result was not merely temporary hardship, but systematic breakdown of the economic and social structures that supported medieval civilization. Grain prices, which had remained relatively stable throughout the prosperity of the 13th century, began to fluctuate wildly as harvest failures created shortages that no amount of royal legislation could remedy. In London, the price of wheat doubled from 20 shillings per quarter in 1315 to 40 shillings per quarter by the following summer, while in less commercially developed regions grain became unavailable at any price. Royal attempts to control prices through maximum price legislation proved not merely ineffective but counterproductive, as merchants preferred to hoard grain rather than sell at artificially low prices. The livestock epidemic that accompanied the agricultural crisis, what contemporary sources called the Great Bovine Pestilence, destroyed the foundation of rural protein production throughout northern Europe. This pathogen, possibly anthrax though its exact nature remains debated by modern scholars, spread from Eastern Asia across Europe between 1315 and 1319, reaching the British Isles by 1319 and killing an estimated 62% of cattle in England and Wales alone. The loss of dairy production, combined with grain shortages, created nutritional deficiencies that weakened human immune systems and increased susceptibility to the epidemic diseases that invariably followed famine. The social consequences of prolonged hunger revealed both the resilience and the limitations of medieval community structures. In many villages, traditional systems of mutual support, the sharing of seed grain, the communal care of orphaned children, the assistance provided to widows and the elderly functioned effectively during the first year of crisis. Yet as the famine continued into its second and third years, these support networks began to break down under the accumulated weight of need. Contemporary accounts describe desperate measures that violated fundamental social norms. Parents abandoning children they could no longer feed. Families consuming seed grain that should have been reserved for the next year's planting, and in the most desperate regions, reports of cannibalism among people driven beyond the limits of civilized behavior. The chronicler of Saint-Denis recorded that in many places people died of hunger lying in the streets, and dogs devoured their corpses, while in some regions the living ate the flesh of the dead. Urban centres, dependent upon agricultural surpluses from the surrounding countryside, faced particular challenges as grain supplies dwindled and prices soared beyond the reach of craft workers and day labourers. The guilds that controlled urban production attempted to maintain traditional wage structures, while food costs increased dramatically, creating conditions that led to the first systematic urban revolts in medieval French history. In Paris, crowds attacked grain merchants suspected of hoarding, while in provincial towns, artisans demanded wage increases that guildmasters could not afford to grant. The royal government's response to the crisis demonstrated both the expanded capabilities of 14th century administration and the ultimate limitations of governmental authority when confronted with natural disasters. Royal ordinances attempted to regulate grain sales, prevent hoarding, and ensure fair distribution of available supplies, while the expanded network of royal officials provided mechanisms for implementing these policies throughout the kingdom. Yet the very scope of the crisis overwhelmed even the most sophisticated administrative systems, as local officials found themselves unable to enforce regulations that conflicted with basic economic realities. The demographic impact of the Great Famine established conditions that would influence European development for generations. Population levels, which had grown steadily throughout the High Middle Ages, declined by an estimated 10 to 15% in Northern Europe, with some regions experiencing even more severe losses. More importantly, the survivors emerged from the crisis with weakened immune systems and depleted resources, creating vulnerability to future epidemics that would have catastrophic consequences. The psychological and cultural effects of the famine proved equally significant in shaping late medieval mentality. The confidence and optimism that had characterized 13th century culture gave way to anxiety and pessimism that found expression in religious movements emphasizing penitence and divine judgment. The prosperity theology that had celebrated material success as evidence of divine favor was replaced by apocalyptic expectations that interpreted natural disasters as signs of approaching divine wrath. The succession crisis that followed the death of Charles of Sceaux in 1328 created the dynastic dispute that would dominate European politics for more than a century. When the last direct Capetian king died without male heirs, the French nobility faced a choice between Philip of Valois, nephew of Philip the Fair, and Edward III of England, grandson of Philip the Fair through his mother Isabella. The decision to crown Philip VI rather than acknowledge Edward's claim established the Valois dynasty, while creating the legal pretext for English intervention in French affairs that would evolve into the 100 Years' War. Edward III's initial acceptance of the French decision reflected practical political calculations rather than abandonment of his claims. As a young king facing domestic challenges and Scottish invasions, Edward could not immediately pursue French ambitions, while Philip VI appeared to be a formidable opponent whose authority seemed secure throughout France. Yet the underlying tension between English and French interests in Aquitaine, combined with the complex web of alliances that connected French and English policies throughout Western Europe, created conditions that made eventual conflict virtually inevitable. The immediate cause of war in 1337 arose from Philip VI's confiscation of Aquitaine, following Edward's refusal to perform homage as Duke of Gascony, and his decision to shelter Robert of Artois, a French exile whom Philip had condemned for treason. Edward's response. the formal assertion of his claim to the French throne and the assumption of the title King of France and England transformed what might have remained a limited territorial dispute into a dynastic war that would reshape the political geography of Western Europe. The naval Battle of Sluys in 1340 demonstrated the strategic importance of controlling sea communications between England and the continent, while revealing the tactical innovations that would characterize this new style of warfare. Edward's fleet, carrying an invasion army destined for Flanders, encountered the French navy in the Zwin estuary, where the English longbowmen proved as effective against enemy ships as they would later prove against enemy armies. The destruction of French naval power ensured English control of the Channel, while enabling the sustained military campaigns that followed. The Crécy campaign of 1346 marked the emergence of tactical innovations that would transform medieval warfare while demonstrating the effectiveness of disciplined professional armies against traditional feudal forces. Edward's march from Normandy to northern France, pursued by Philip VI's much larger army, culminated in the battle that established English military reputation throughout Europe. On the field of Crécy, English longbowmen, protected by dismounted men-at-arms and supported by primitive firearms, destroyed the flower of French chivalry through disciplined missile warfare that made heavy cavalry charges obsolete. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic nature of the English victory, achieved through tactical coordination that reflected careful planning rather than spontaneous heroism. Jean Froissart's chronicle records how the English, who were drawn up in 3 divisions and seated on the ground, on seeing their enemies advance, arose boldly and fell into their ranks. That of the prince was the first to do so, whose archers were formed in the manner of a portcullis or harrow, and the men-at-arms in the rear. The death of King John of Bohemia, the capture of numerous French nobles, and the flight of Philip VI established patterns of English tactical superiority that would persist throughout the early stages of the war. The Black Death that reached Europe in 1347 created a demographic catastrophe that overshadowed even the military disasters of the previous decade. This pandemic, spreading along the trade routes that connected Asia with Europe, killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, fundamentally altering the social and economic structures of medieval civilization. In France, the plague struck a population already weakened by military defeat and economic disruption, creating conditions that would influence the course of the war for generations. Contemporary accounts describe the plague's progression with a mixture of clinical observation and religious interpretation that reflected medieval efforts to comprehend unprecedented catastrophe. The physician Guy de Chauliac, serving at the papal court in Avignon, recorded the symptoms with medical precision. The mortality began with us in the month of January and lasted 7 months. It was of 2 kinds. The first lasted 2 months, with continuous fever and spitting of blood. The second was all the rest of the time, also with continuous fever and with tumours in the external parts, chiefly in the armpits and groin. The social consequences of demographic collapse transformed medieval society in ways that would influence European development for centuries. The massive mortality created labour shortages that enabled surviving peasants to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and greater personal freedom. Traditional manorial relationships based on the premise that peasant labour was abundant and cheap collapsed when lords found themselves competing for scarce workers. The commutation of labour services into money rents accelerated as lords discovered that cash payments provided more flexibility than traditional feudal obligations. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356 demonstrated that English tactical superiority remained effective even after a decade of French efforts to adapt to new military realities. Prince Edward, known as the Black Prince, led a raid through southern France that culminated in a defensive battle where English longbowmen again destroyed French heavy cavalry, while capturing King John II and numerous nobles whose ransoms would finance continued English campaigns. The humiliation of French monarchy, symbolised by the captivity of the king in London, created political chaos that would persist until John's death in 1364. The Jacquerie of 1358 revealed the social tensions that had been building throughout the early decades of the 14th century, as peasants devastated by war, plague, and economic disruption finally revolted against the nobles who had failed to protect them. This uprising, centred in the regions north of Paris where English raids had been most destructive, represented not merely economic protest, but fundamental questioning of the social order that justified noble privilege through military service. The brutal suppression of the revolt, led by nobles who showed no mercy toward rebels who had dared to challenge their authority, demonstrated the determination of the ruling class to maintain traditional hierarchies despite their military failures. Contemporary chroniclers like Jean Froissart described the savagery that characterized both the revolt and its suppression. These evil people began to kill and destroy all the nobles they could find, and to burn and destroy everything. And when the nobles heard of these outrageous and horrible deeds, they gathered together from all sides and began to kill these wicked people and to destroy them without pity. The massacre at Meaux, where noble forces slaughtered thousands of peasants who had sought refuge in the market town, established precedents for aristocratic response to popular rebellion that would influence French social development for generations. The recovery of French fortunes under Charles V, who became king in 1364, demonstrated that military innovation could overcome English tactical advantages, while systematic administration could mobilize national resources more effectively than feudal levies. Charles, called the Wise for his political acumen, abandoned the chivalric ideals that had led to disasters at Crécy and Poitiers in favor of pragmatic policies that emphasized siege warfare, economic pressure, and diplomatic isolation of English forces. The military reforms associated with Bertrand du Guesclin, the Breton knight who became Charles of Atho's constable, established new patterns of warfare that negated English advantages while exploiting French strengths. Rather than seeking decisive battles where English longbowmen could massacre French knights, Du Guesclin employed guerrilla tactics, siege warfare, and systematic devastation of English-held territories. His policy of avoiding major engagements while recapturing French fortresses one by one proved remarkably effective, as English garrisons found themselves isolated and vulnerable to systematic pressure. By the death of Charles V in 1380, French forces had recaptured most of the territories conquered by English armies over the previous 4 decades, while diplomatic pressure had isolated England from potential continental allies. Yet this recovery had been achieved at enormous cost in human life, economic resources, and social stability, creating conditions that would continue to influence French development throughout the remainder of the medieval period. The cultural achievements of late medieval France reflected the complex interaction between crisis and creativity that characterized this remarkable period. Even as war, plague, and social upheaval disrupted traditional patterns of life, French civilization produced literary, artistic, and intellectual innovations that would influence European culture for centuries to come. The vernacular literature that emerged during these decades established French as a sophisticated medium for serious intellectual and artistic expression, while creating literary traditions that would inspire authors throughout Europe. Christine de Pizan, writing at the turn of the 15th century, exemplified the new possibilities that crisis had created for literary expression. As perhaps the first professional woman writer in European history, Christine supported herself and her family through literary production that ranged from courtly poetry to political treatises, from moral instruction to historical narrative. Her works, including the Book of the City of Ladies and the Book of the Body Politic, demonstrated that vernacular French could serve as effectively as Latin for sophisticated intellectual discourse while establishing new models for feminine participation in literary culture. The chronicles of Jean Froissart provided contemporary audiences with unprecedented access to the dramatic events of their age, while establishing standards for historical narrative that influenced chroniclers throughout Europe. Froissart's accounts of battles and diplomatic negotiations based on interviews with participants and personal observation of court life created vivid portraits of 14th century society that combined journalistic immediacy with literary sophistication. His description of the Battle of Crécy, quoted extensively by later historians, demonstrates the emerging tradition of vernacular historical writing that made the past accessible to audiences beyond clerical circles. The artistic innovations associated with the International Gothic style reflected both the continuing patronage of French nobility and the cultural exchange that characterized late medieval Europe. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Parisian workshops during the late 14th century combined traditional Gothic elements with influences from Italian Renaissance art, creating distinctive syntheses that would influence European artistic development for generations. The Très Riche, Heure du Duc de Berry, created by the Limbourg brothers for John, Duke of Berry, exemplified this artistic achievement through calendar illustrations that portrayed aristocratic life with unprecedented realism and technical sophistication. The religious crisis that accompanied political and social upheaval found expression in mystical movements that emphasized direct personal experience of divine truth rather than institutional mediation through established ecclesiastical authorities. The Devotio Moderna, originating in the Low Countries but influential throughout France, promoted forms of religious practice that enabled laypeople to pursue spiritual perfection through personal devotion and charitable activity. This movement produced literary works like The Imitation of Christ that would become fundamental texts of European spirituality while establishing precedents for religious reform that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. The universities that had emerged during the High Middle Ages faced particular challenges during the crisis centuries, as traditional systems of ecclesiastical patronage and royal support were disrupted by war and economic difficulty. Yet the University of Paris, despite periods of closure during the most intense phases of the 100 Years' War, continued to attract students from throughout Europe while producing scholars whose works advanced human knowledge in theology, philosophy, natural science, and law. The nominalist philosophy associated with scholars like William of Ockham challenged traditional scholastic assumptions while establishing new approaches to logical analysis that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. The economic disruption that accompanied demographic collapse and military devastation paradoxically created opportunities for technological innovation and commercial development that would prove crucial for European recovery. The labour shortages resulting from plague mortality encouraged the development of labour-saving technologies, including improvements in water-powered machinery, innovations in agricultural techniques, and advances in manufacturing processes that increase productivity while reducing dependence on human labour. The monetary innovations necessitated by the financial demands of prolonged warfare established precedents for royal control over currency that would become fundamental features of early modern state development. The systematic debasement of silver coinage, while creating immediate hardship for people whose savings lost value, also encouraged economic activity by making debt repayment easier and stimulating demand for goods and services. These policies, while controversial among contemporary observers, established techniques of monetary manipulation that would become standard tools of royal finance. The architectural achievements of late medieval France, despite the reduced resources available for construction projects, demonstrated remarkable innovation in both engineering techniques and artistic expression. The completion of great cathedrals like Rheims and Amiens during this period required solutions to structural problems that advanced understanding of Gothic construction, while creating artistic effects that influenced ecclesiastical building throughout Europe. The Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, with its walls of stained glass that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between earthly and heavenly space, established new possibilities for architectural expression that would inspire church builders for generations. The emergence of courtly romance as a sophisticated literary genre reflected the cultural refinement of aristocratic society even during periods of military and political crisis. The Arthurian romances composed during this period created idealized models of knightly behavior that influenced noble self-perception, while establishing literary traditions that would persist throughout European culture. The concept of courtly love, with its elaborate codes of behavior and complex emotional relationships, provided aristocratic society with cultural frameworks for understanding personal relationships, while creating artistic traditions that would influence European literature for centuries. The development of legal scholarship during the crisis centuries established foundations for the systematic legal codes that would characterize early modern European states. The expansion of royal courts and the growing sophistication of legal procedures required trained jurists who understood both Roman law and local customs, creating demand for legal education that universities throughout France struggled to meet. The emergence of legal humanism, emphasizing the historical development of legal institutions rather than merely their contemporary application, established scholarly approaches that would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. These cultural achievements, emerging from one of the most challenging periods in medieval European history, demonstrated the remarkable resilience of human creativity when confronted with crisis and catastrophe. The France that emerged from the crisis centuries had been transformed by its ordeal, yet it had also preserved and developed cultural traditions that would continue to influence European civilization throughout the early modern period and beyond. The death of Charles V in 1380 marked the beginning of the most catastrophic period in medieval French history, as the carefully constructed recovery achieved through Du Guesclin's military innovations and diplomatic patience collapsed beneath the weight of royal madness, noble ambition, and foreign invasion. Charles VI, ascending the throne at age 11, would rule for 42 years, yet for much of that time, his periodic descents into madness left France effectively without royal leadership, while great nobles fought savage civil wars that invited English intervention on an unprecedented scale. The first signs of the king's mental instability appeared in 1392, during a military expedition to Brittany, when Charles suddenly attacked his own companions in a forest clearing, killing 4 knights before being subdued and restrained. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to understand this unprecedented breakdown of royal authority, some attributing it to sorcery, others to divine punishment for the sins of the kingdom, while modern historians recognize symptoms consistent with what would now be diagnosed as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. During the king's lucid periods, Charles VI demonstrated the intelligence and political acumen that had characterized his father's reign, issuing thoughtful legislation, patronizing artistic projects, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with foreign courts. Yet these intervals of competent rule became increasingly brief as the years passed, separated by longer periods of complete withdrawal from reality, when the king would refuse to recognize his wife and children, believe himself to be made of glass and might shatter if touched, or wander the corridors of royal palaces howling like a wolf. The power vacuum created by royal incapacity was filled by competing factions of great nobles, each claiming to represent the king's true interests while pursuing their own territorial and political ambitions. The Armagnac party, led initially by Louis of Orléans, the king's brother, represented the traditional court nobility and favoured aggressive policies toward England and Burgundy. The assassination of Louis of Orléans in 1407, arranged by John the Fearless during one of the king's periods of madness, transformed factional competition into blood feud that would devastate France for decades. The brutal murder, carried out by masked men in a Paris street, violated every principle of chivalric conduct while demonstrating that traditional constraints on noble behaviour had collapsed completely under the pressure of civil conflict. Bernard of Armagnac, who gave his name to the faction opposing Burgundian dominance, proved to be a ruthless and capable leader whose methods matched those of his Burgundian opponents. The civil war that consumed France between 1407 and 1420 witnessed atrocities that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to the brutalities of the 100 Years' War. The massacre of prisoners, the systematic devastation of enemy territories, the employment of mercenary companies that terrorized civilian populations, and the use of popular uprising as a weapon of factional politics. The Cabotian Revolt of 1413, orchestrated by Burgundian agents among the Parisian artisan classes, demonstrated how civil war had corrupted even urban society, as guild members armed themselves to attack noble residences, while royal officials fled the capital or switched allegiance according to immediate advantage. The revolt's suppression by Armagnac forces led to mass executions that left Parisian streets stained with blood, while establishing precedents for popular participation in noble conflicts that would influence French political development for centuries. Into this chaos stepped Henry V of England, whose accession in 1413 coincided with his recognition that French civil war provided unprecedented opportunities for English territorial expansion. Unlike his predecessors, who had pursued French claims primarily for dynastic legitimacy, Henry possessed both the military resources and political determination necessary to transform English pretensions into territorial reality. His invasion of Normandy in 1415, following careful diplomatic preparation and systematic military planning, found France incapable of unified resistance. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415, became the most famous English victory of the entire 100 Years' War, demonstrating once again the tactical superiority of disciplined longbow armies over traditional feudal cavalry. Henry's army, exhausted by the march from Harfleur and reduced by disease to perhaps 6,000 men, confronted a French army estimated at 24,000 that included the flower of Armagnac nobility determined to restore French military honour. The muddy fields of Agincourt became a killing ground where French knights, weighed down by armour and struggling through deep mud, fell victim to volleys of English arrows that could penetrate even the finest plate armour at close range. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic slaughter that followed the initial arrow storms, as English men-at-arms moved through the field dispatching wounded French nobles, while archers continued to shoot down advancing reinforcements. The death toll among French nobility at Agincourt approached catastrophic proportions, with casualties including Charles of Orleans, John of Bourbon, and dozens of counts, barons, and knights, whose deaths eliminated an entire generation of military leadership. The capture of numerous high-ranking prisoners, including the Duke of Orleans, provided Henry with both immediate ransom income and long-term diplomatic leverage, while depriving France of leaders who might have organised effective resistance to continued English expansion. The diplomatic revolution that followed Agincourt demonstrated Henry V's understanding that military victory required political consolidation to achieve lasting results. The assassination of John the Fearless in 1419 during a supposed reconciliation meeting with the Dauphin Charles provided Henry with the opportunity he needed to secure Burgundian alliance against the remnants of Armagnac power. Philip the Good, inheriting both his father's duchy and his father's murderers as enemies, chose English alliance as the means of achieving revenge against those responsible for Burgundian losses. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in May 1420, represented the complete triumph of English diplomatic and military pressure over French resistance. This extraordinary document recognised Henry V as heir to the French throne, arranged his marriage to Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, and explicitly disinherited the Dauphin Charles, who was declared illegitimate and unworthy of succession. The treaty's ratification by the Estates General of France provided legal legitimacy to arrangements that had been achieved through military conquest and diplomatic manipulation. Contemporary observers recognized the Treaty of Troyes as marking a fundamental transformation in the balance of European power, with England achieving through systematic warfare what centuries of earlier conflicts had failed to accomplish: effective control over the French monarchy and legal claim to French territories. Yet the treaty's implementation required continued military pressure against those French territories that remained loyal to the Dauphin, creating conditions for prolonged warfare that would test the sustainability of English achievements. The Siege of Orleans, beginning in October 1428, represented the climax of English military success in France, as forces commanded by the Earl of Salisbury invested one of the most heavily defended cities in Europe with artillery trains that included more cannons than the defenders possessed. The strategic importance of Orleans, controlling the Loire Valley and protecting the Dauphin's territories south of the river, made its capture essential to English plans for complete conquest of France, while its defence represented the last hope for French resistance to total submission. The death of Salisbury, killed by a French cannonball while surveying the city's defences, deprived the English siege of its most competent commander, while providing French defenders with evidence that their cause retained divine favour. Yet the English siege works, constructed with methodical precision around the city's perimeter, gradually tightened their grip on Orléans through the winter of 1428-1429, intercepting supply convoys and preventing reinforcement, while artillery bombardment reduced sections of the city walls to rubble. Into this desperate situation came Joan of Arc, a 17-year-old peasant girl from Domremy, who convinced the Dauphin's court that she had received divine visions commanding her to drive the English from France and secure Charles's coronation at Reims. Contemporary accounts describe a young woman of remarkable personal charisma and unshakable religious conviction, whose peasant origins and claims of direct communication with saints initially provoked skepticism among courtiers accustomed to more conventional forms of political and military leadership. Joan's examination by theologians at Poitiers, designed to determine whether her visions derived from divine or diabolic sources, revealed a personality that combined simple faith with sophisticated understanding of political realities. Her insistence that God had chosen her to restore legitimate royal authority, her detailed knowledge of military matters despite her rural background, and her unwavering confidence in ultimate French victory impressed even sceptical observers who had initially dismissed her claims as peasant superstition. The transformation of Joan from visionary peasant girl to military commander reflected the desperate circumstances that led the Dauphin's government to embrace any potential source of hope, however unlikely its origins. Equipped with armour specially made for her small stature, mounted on a war horse, and provided with a banner bearing images of Christ and the saints, Joan embodied a fusion of religious devotion and military purpose that would prove remarkably effective in restoring French morale. Joan's arrival at Orléans on April 29, 1429, coincided with French tactical innovations that exploited weaknesses in the English siege works while taking advantage of popular enthusiasm generated by her presence. The series of assaults that followed her arrival, culminating in the capture of English fortifications around the city, forced the English army to abandon the siege after only 9 days of fighting following Joan's arrival, marking the first major French victory in decades. The rapid succession of French victories that followed the relief of Orléans demonstrated how Joan's presence had transformed both military capabilities and popular attitudes throughout French territories that remained loyal to the Dauphin. Towns and fortresses that had resisted French forces for years suddenly opened their gates, while English garrisons that had seemed invincible found themselves overwhelmed by French armies fighting with unprecedented determination and effectiveness. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429, achieved Joan's primary objective while providing French monarchy with the religious legitimacy that had been denied by the Treaty of Troyes. The ancient ceremony, performed with traditional rituals that connected the new king to Clovis and Charlemagne, demonstrated that France remained an independent kingdom despite English military occupations and Burgundian alliance with foreign invaders. Joan's capture during the siege of Compiègne on May 23, 1430, by Burgundian forces allied with the English, marked the beginning of proceedings that would transform a peasant visionary into one of history's most famous martyrs. The political trial that followed, conducted by ecclesiastical courts under English supervision, attempted to discredit French victories by proving that Joan's inspiration derived from diabolic rather than divine sources. The trial proceedings, carefully recorded by scribes whose transcripts survive in remarkable detail, reveal both the sophistication of medieval inquisitorial procedures and the extraordinary personality of the young woman who faced charges of heresy, witchcraft, and unauthorized assumption of male authority. Joan's responses to her interrogators, combining theological knowledge with stubborn insistence on the authenticity of her visions, impressed even hostile observers with their consistency and conviction. Joan's execution by burning in the marketplace of Rouen on May 30, 1431, was intended by English authorities to demonstrate the fraudulent nature of French resistance, while deterring future challenges to English authority. Yet the spectacle of a 19-year-old girl dying for her religious and political convictions produced the opposite effect, creating a martyred saint whose memory would inspire French resistance for centuries to come. The defection of Burgundy from the English alliance, formalised by the Treaty of Arras in 1435, fundamentally altered the strategic situation by depriving England of its most powerful continental ally, while providing France with resources necessary for systematic reconquest of English-held territories. Philip the Good's reconciliation with Charles VII, achieved through papal mediation and French territorial concessions, reflected Burgundian recognition that English alliance no longer served Burgundian interests in a conflict where French recovery seemed increasingly probable. The military innovations that characterized the final phase of the 100 Years' War demonstrated how systematic application of artillery and professional military organization could overcome the tactical advantages that had sustained English dominance for decades. French forces, reorganized under royal authority and equipped with siege artillery superior to English weapons, began the methodical reduction of English fortifications throughout Normandy and Guyenne. The conquest of Normandy between 1449 and 1450 proceeded with remarkable speed, as English garrisons, isolated from reinforcement and facing French armies, equipped with advanced artillery, surrendered fortresses that had been considered impregnable. The capture of Cherbourg, Caen, and finally Rouen restored French control over territories that had been under English rule for more than 30 years, while demonstrating the effectiveness of new military technologies when applied systematically. The final reconquest of Guyenne in 1453 completed the territorial recovery that had begun with Joan of Arc's relief of Orleans. As French forces equipped with superior artillery overwhelmed English defences that could no longer rely on tactical innovations developed during the early phases of the war. The Battle of Castillon, fought on July 17, 1453, marked the definitive end of English territorial ambitions in France, when French artillery destroyed the last English field army in a battle that demonstrated the obsolescence of medieval military techniques. The recovery of French territories during the final decades of the 100 Years' War was accompanied by administrative and military innovations that transformed medieval French monarchy into the institutional foundations of early modern absolute government. Charles VII's response to the crisis that had nearly destroyed French independence involved systematic reconstruction of royal authority through new governmental techniques that would influence European political development for centuries. The recovery of French territories during the final decades of the 100 Years' War was accompanied by administrative and military innovations that transformed medieval French monarchy into the institutional foundations of early modern absolute government. Charles VII's response to the crisis that had nearly destroyed French independence involved systematic reconstruction of royal authority through new governmental techniques that would influence European political development for centuries. The creation of a standing army, formalized through the Ordinance of 1445, represented the most significant military innovation of the late medieval period, replacing traditional feudal levies with professional troops paid directly by the crown and subject to royal discipline. The Compagnie d'Ordonnance, consisting of heavily armed cavalry supported by infantry and artillery units, provided French monarchy with military resources that could be deployed rapidly and maintained continuously, eliminating the seasonal nature of medieval warfare while ensuring royal independence from feudal obligations. The fiscal innovations necessary to support professional military forces required fundamental changes in royal taxation that extended governmental authority into every aspect of economic life throughout France. The taille, originally an extraordinary tax levied during military emergencies, became a permanent royal revenue that could be assessed annually without consultation with traditional representative assemblies, providing the crown with financial independence that had eluded previous medieval monarchs. The development of royal bureaucracy during this period created administrative systems that could implement royal policies throughout territories recovered from English occupation while integrating these regions into unified governmental structures. The baillie and seneschals who had administered royal territories during the High Middle Ages evolved into professional civil servants, whose authority derived entirely from royal appointment, and whose careers depended upon effective implementation of crown policies. The legal unification that accompanied territorial recovery involved the systematic codification of customary laws that had developed in different regions during centuries of fragmented authority. Royal legal scholars, working under crown auspices, began the process of harmonizing local customs with Roman law principles while establishing royal courts as the supreme judicial authority throughout the kingdom, creating legal frameworks that would eventually support absolute monarchy. The economic recovery that followed the end of prolonged warfare demonstrated the remarkable resilience of medieval French society when provided with political stability and effective governance. The demographic renewal that began during the 1450s saw population levels gradually approach pre-plague numbers, while agricultural production expanded to support both growing urban centres and the military establishments necessary for royal security. The commercial expansion that characterized the late 15th century reflected both the removal of military obstacles to trade and the development of royal policies that encouraged economic activity. The fairs of Lyon and other commercial centres became international meeting places where French merchants could compete effectively with Italian and Flemish counterparts, generating customs revenues that supplemented direct taxation while creating urban prosperity that supported royal authority. The monetary innovations implemented during this period provided royal government with tools for economic manipulation that extended crown influence throughout the French economy. The standardization of coinage, the regulation of exchange rates, and the development of royal credit systems all contributed to the creation of national economic integration that had been impossible during earlier periods of political fragmentation. The cultural transformation that accompanied French political recovery during the late 15th century reflected both indigenous developments within French civilization and the influence of Italian Renaissance ideas that began to penetrate France through diplomatic, commercial, and intellectual contacts. The royal patronage of arts and letters that characterized the reigns of Charles VII and Louis X created conditions for cultural achievement that would establish France as a leading centre of European Renaissance culture. The manuscript illumination that reached its peak during this period demonstrated the continuing vitality of Gothic artistic traditions, even as Renaissance influences began to appear in French cultural production. The workshop of Jean Fouquet, working under royal patronage, created illuminated manuscripts that combined traditional French techniques with Renaissance innovations in perspective and classical motifs, establishing artistic syntheses that would influence European book production for generations. The introduction of printing to France during the 1470s revolutionized the production and distribution of books, while creating new opportunities for cultural exchange throughout Europe. The printing shops established in Paris, Lyon, and other French cities began producing not only religious and scholarly texts, but also vernacular literature that made sophisticated cultural production accessible to growing audiences among merchant and artisan classes. The architectural innovations that characterized late 15th century France reflected the gradual penetration of Renaissance ideas into traditional Gothic building techniques. The chateaux constructed by royal and noble patrons during this period combined medieval defensive features with Renaissance decorative elements, creating distinctive French architectural styles that would influence European building for centuries. The literary achievements of this transitional period demonstrated the maturation of French vernacular culture and its growing confidence in competing with Italian Renaissance literature. The works of authors like Christine de Pizan and others established French as a sophisticated medium for serious intellectual and artistic expression, while creating literary traditions that would inspire writers throughout Europe. The religious reform movements that emerged during this period reflected both the continuing vitality of medieval Christian traditions and the influence of humanist ideas that emphasized personal religious experience and scholarly examination of religious texts. The Devotio Moderna and other reform movements provided alternatives to traditional monasticism while establishing precedents for the religious changes that would characterize the early modern period. The scholarly developments associated with the University of Paris and other French educational institutions during this period prepared the intellectual foundations for French participation in Renaissance humanism, while maintaining the theological and philosophical traditions that had made medieval French scholarship influential throughout Europe. The diplomatic innovations that characterized French international relations during the late 15th century demonstrated the growing sophistication of royal government in managing complex European political relationships. The development of permanent diplomatic missions, the use of professional ambassadors, and the systematic collection of international intelligence all contributed to French emergence as a major European power. As the 15th century drew to a close, France had been transformed from a kingdom nearly destroyed by foreign invasion and civil war into a unified monarchy possessing the military, administrative, and financial resources necessary for European leadership. The governmental institutions, cultural achievements, and territorial unity established during the recovery from the 100 Years' War provided the foundations upon which early modern French monarchy would build its claims to European hegemony, while the sense of national identity forged during the struggle against English domination would inspire French political development for centuries to come. As the smoke of battle cleared from the fields of Castillon and the last English garrisons sailed from Norman ports, the vast majority of French people returned to the rhythms that had sustained human life for centuries. The endless cycle of planting and harvest, the careful tending of animals, the patient work of maintaining the small villages that dotted the countryside like stars scattered across the landscape of medieval France. For while kings fought wars and nobles pursued glory, it was the peasant farmers who formed the foundation upon which all medieval civilization rested, their labour providing the food that fed the growing cities, the surplus that supported royal armies, and the stability that enabled the cultural achievements we remember from this remarkable age. The medieval French village, whether nestled in the Loire Valley beneath limestone cliffs, or carved from forest clearings in the mountains of the Massif Central, followed patterns of organisation that had evolved over centuries of trial and adaptation. At its heart stood the parish church, its stone bell tower visible from the surrounding fields, its bells marking not only the hours of prayer but the rhythm of daily work, calling villagers to morning mass before dawn, announcing the midday pause for rest and sustenance, and signalling the end of labour as shadows lengthened across the fields. Around this spiritual centre, the houses of peasant families clustered according to social position and family relationships that stretched back through generations. The more prosperous farmers, those who owned their own oxen and possessed sufficient land to support their families throughout the year, built houses of stone and timber that could shelter extended families through the harsh winters. Their homes, though modest by noble standards, contained separate rooms for different activities, a main hall where the family gathered around the central hearth, sleeping chambers for parents and children, storage areas for grain and tools, and often workshops where household crafts supplemented agricultural income. The agricultural techniques that sustained these communities had been refined through centuries of experimentation and adaptation to local conditions. The three-field system, which had gradually replaced earlier two-field methods throughout northern France, allowed peasants to maintain soil fertility while maximizing production from limited acreage. One field would be planted with winter wheat or rye, sown in autumn and harvested the following summer. A second field received spring crops oats, barley or legumes like peas and beans that restored nitrogen to the soil. The third field lay fallow, providing pasture for livestock whose manure would fertilize the soil for the following year's planting. The heavy plough, drawn by teams of oxen or horses, could turn the dense clay soils of northern France that had remained uncultivated during earlier periods when only lighter ploughs were available. This technological innovation, combined with the horse collar that allowed more efficient use of animal power, enabled medieval farmers to bring marginal lands under cultivation while reducing the human labour required for basic agricultural tasks. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural life created a calendar that remained unchanged for generations. each month bringing its particular tasks and challenges. January and February were times for indoor work repairing tools, making clothing, processing the previous year's harvest into flour and preserves that would sustain the family until spring. March brought the first ploughing of fields designated for spring crops, while April saw the sowing of oats and barley, peas and beans, in soil that had been carefully prepared through months of winter weathering. May was the month of sheep shearing, when the wool that would become clothing for the coming year was harvested and prepared for spinning. June brought the hay harvest, that crucial first cutting of grass that would provide winter fodder for livestock, whose survival meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. July was the month of the grain harvest, when entire communities worked together to gather the wheat and rye that represented the year's primary food supply. Contemporary agricultural manuals, like the treatise written by Walter of Henley, provided detailed instructions for managing these seasonal activities. In August you ought to reap your wheat, and at Michaelmas your oats. In September you ought to sow your wheat. In October have your land ploughed for fallow and sow your rye. In November have the dung led out and spread, and plough your land. These cycles, repeated year after year with minor variations, created the fundamental stability that enabled medieval civilization to flourish, despite periodic disruptions from war, famine, or epidemic. The manor system that governed rural life throughout medieval France created relationships of mutual obligation that bound peasants to their lords, while ensuring that agricultural production could continue even during periods of political instability. The lord of the manor provided protection through his castle and its garrison, justice through his manorial court, and economic coordination through his officials who supervised planting, harvesting, and the maintenance of roads, bridges, and other infrastructure essential to rural life. In return, peasant families owed their lord various forms of service and payment that reflected their status within the manorial hierarchy. Free peasants who owned their own land typically owed military service during times of war and money payments in lieu of other obligations. Villeins who held land in exchange for agricultural labour worked the lord's domain for a specified number of days each week while maintaining their own family plots. Serfs, bound to the land and unable to leave without their lord's permission, owed the most extensive obligations, but also enjoyed the greatest protection from economic disaster. The religious festivals that punctuated the agricultural year provided not only spiritual comfort, but essential breaks from labour, while reinforcing the social bonds that held medieval communities together. Christmas brought 12 days of celebration that coincided with the winter pause in agricultural work, when stored food could be consumed in communal feasting, and when the long nights encouraged storytelling that preserved folk traditions across generations. Easter, marking the resurrection of Christ and the renewal of life, coincided with spring planting and the return of agricultural activity after winter's rest. The Feast of Lammas, celebrated on August 1st, marked the beginning of harvest season with church services that blessed the first fruits of the year's labour. The festival of Michaelmas, on September 29th, celebrated the completion of harvest while providing occasion for settling accounts, renewing contracts, and making the payments that sustained the manor's economy throughout the coming year. These religious observances reflected the deep integration of Christian faith with agricultural practice that characterized medieval rural life. Peasants blessed their ploughs before spring ploughing, participated in Rogation Day processions that invoked divine protection for growing crops, and observed numerous saints' days that corresponded to particular agricultural activities. St. Blais protected livestock, St. Apollonia guarded against toothache, while St. Barbara offered protection from lightning that could destroy barns and houses. Yet even as most French people continued to live according to agricultural rhythms, the centuries following the year 1000 witnessed the remarkable growth of towns and cities that would transform medieval society while creating new forms of economic organization and cultural achievement. The urban revival that began during the High Middle Ages continued through periods of crisis and recovery, producing by the late medieval period a network of commercial centres that connected French merchants with markets stretching from London to Constantinople, from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. Paris itself embodied this urban transformation, growing from a fortified island in the Seine to a metropolis that housed perhaps 200,000 inhabitants by the reign of Louis IX. The city's expansion beyond its original walls created distinct districts, each with its own character and economic specialization. The Ile de la Cité remained the center of royal and ecclesiastical authority, dominated by the palace complex and Notre Dame Cathedral. The right bank became the commercial heart of the city, where merchants from throughout Europe gathered in markets that operated under royal protection and regulation. The left bank, known as the Latin Quarter for the language spoken in its schools and universities, housed the intellectual life that made Paris famous throughout Christendom. Here, in narrow streets lined with bookshops and student lodgings, young men from every corner of Europe came to study theology, philosophy, law, and the liberal arts. The University of Paris, emerging from the cathedral schools of the 12th century, had by the 13th century become the most prestigious centre of learning in Western Europe, its masters and students forming a self-governing corporation that enjoyed royal protection and ecclesiastical privileges. The guild system that governed urban crafts and commerce created new forms of social organisation that enabled skilled artisans to achieve prosperity and status that would have been impossible under purely agricultural conditions. Each craft, from goldsmiths and furriers to bakers and shoemakers, developed its own guild with elaborate regulations that controlled entrance to the profession, maintained quality standards, and provided mutual support for members and their families. The Guild of Goldsmiths in Paris, for example, required 7 years of apprenticeship followed by several more years as a journeyman before a craftsman could establish his own workshop and become a master. The guild's regulations specified the purity of metals used, the techniques employed in manufacture, and the marks that identified each master's work. Guild members contributed to a common fund that supported widows and orphans, maintained the guild's chapel, and funded the charitable activities that demonstrated the guild's commitment to Christian principles. The great commercial fairs that flourished throughout medieval France created temporary cities, where merchants from distant lands could meet in safety to exchange goods that ranged from English wool to Oriental spices, from Flemish textiles to German silver. The fairs of Champagne, held in rotation at Troyes, Provins, Lagny, and Bar-sur-Aube, became the most important commercial centres in medieval Europe, attracting merchants who travelled for months to participate in markets that lasted for weeks at a time. These gatherings required elaborate organisation to ensure fairness and security for merchants, who might be carrying their entire fortunes in goods and currency. The Counts of Champagne provided military protection, while royal officials supervised the complex legal procedures necessary for international commerce. Special courts heard disputes between merchants, while standardized weights and measures ensured fair trading practices. Money changers, operating under strict regulation, enabled merchants to convert the bewildering variety of medieval currencies into acceptable forms of payment. The architectural transformation that accompanied urban growth created the distinctive townscapes that still characterize many French cities today. The narrow, winding streets of medieval town centres reflected organic growth patterns, as buildings were constructed wherever space became available, often encroaching on public ways and creating the intimate urban environments that fostered both commercial activity and social interaction. Urban houses, built primarily of wood and stone, rose to several stories to maximize the use of expensive urban land. Ground floors typically housed shops or workshops, with the merchant or craftsman's family living in chambers above while apprentices and servants occupied the topmost floors. The guild halls and townhouses built by prosperous merchants demonstrated growing urban wealth while establishing architectural precedents that influenced building throughout the medieval period. The transition from Romanesque to Gothic architectural styles found its most dramatic expression in the urban cathedrals that rose throughout France during the High Middle Ages. These massive construction projects, requiring decades to complete and consuming vast resources, demonstrated both the wealth generated by urban commerce and the religious devotion that motivated medieval communities to undertake such ambitious enterprises. Notre Dame of Paris, begun in 1163, exemplified this architectural revolution while serving as the spiritual centre of the growing metropolis. Its soaring nave, illuminated by vast windows filled with stained glass, created interior spaces that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between earthly and heavenly realms. The cathedral's western facade, with its elaborate sculptural programs depicting biblical and historical scenes, served as a stone encyclopedia that educated viewers while inspiring devotion. The technical innovations that made Gothic architecture possible, flying buttresses, pointed arches, ribbed vaults, enabled medieval builders to create structures of unprecedented height and luminosity while maintaining structural integrity. These engineering advances reflected the growing sophistication of medieval technology and the emergence of professional architects and engineers who could manage complex construction projects. High above the villages and towns where most French people lived and worked rose the castles of the nobility, those stone monuments to feudal authority that dominated the medieval landscape while housing a distinctive culture that would influence European civilization for centuries. The great keeps and fortified manor houses that dotted the French countryside served not only as military strongholds, but as centres of a sophisticated social system that combined Germanic warrior traditions with Christian ideals and classical learning. Castle life followed rhythms determined by the seasons and the obligations of feudal lordship, creating daily routines that balanced military preparedness with agricultural management, judicial duties with cultural pursuits. The Great Hall, heart of every noble residence, served as the centre of communal life, where the lord's extended household gathered for meals, entertainment, and the transaction of business that governed local society. The morning hours in a medieval castle typically began before dawn with prayers in the private chapel, where the lord and his family joined household servants and retainers in observing the daily offices that structured Christian life. After breaking their fast with bread and ale, weak wine or watered wine, the lord would hold court to hear legal disputes, receive reports from his officials, and conduct the administrative business necessary to manage estates that might include dozens of villages and thousands of inhabitants. The training of young nobles began in childhood with instruction designed to prepare them for their future roles as military leaders and estate managers. Boys destined for knighthood learned to ride war horses, handle weapons, and understand the complex social relationships that governed feudal society. They studied Latin to read legal documents and religious texts, learned basic arithmetic for managing accounts, and developed the social skills necessary for diplomatic negotiations and court life. The ceremony of knighthood, typically performed when a young nobleman reached his majority, represented both a religious sacrament and a social contract that defined his place within the feudal hierarchy. The candidate spent the night before his dubbing in prayer and fasting, contemplating the responsibilities he would assume with his new status. The ceremony itself, performed before witnesses in a church or castle hall, included the blessing of sword and spurs, the oath of loyalty to his lord, and the ritual blow that formally inducted him into the Brotherhood of Knights. The chivalric ideals that governed knightly conduct represented a fusion of Christian morality with warrior honour that created distinctive codes of behaviour for medieval nobility. The knight was expected to be brave in battle but merciful to defeated enemies, loyal to his lord but protective of the innocent, devout in his religious observances but courteous in his social relationships. These ideals, though often honoured more in theory than practice, established behavioural standards that influenced European aristocratic culture for centuries. The tournaments that provided entertainment for noble courts while offering opportunities for young knights to demonstrate their martial skills evolved from simple combat practice into elaborate spectacles that showcased aristocratic wealth and power. The tournament field became a theatre where knights competed for prizes and honour while ladies observed from pavilions decorated with silk and gold. The literature of courtly romance that emerged during the High Middle Ages created idealised versions of noble life that influenced aristocratic self-perception while establishing literary traditions that would inspire writers throughout Europe. The Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes presented models of knightly behaviour that combined military prowess with refined sensibility, while the songs of troubadours celebrated idealized relationships between knights and noble ladies. The concept of courtly love that developed within this literary tradition established new patterns of social interaction between men and women of the aristocratic class. The knight who served his lady with devotion comparable to religious worship, who undertook quests and endured hardships to prove his worthiness, who sublimated physical desire into spiritual devotion, became a cultural ideal that influenced European literature and society for generations. The heraldic traditions that emerged during the later medieval period provided visual symbols that identified noble families, while proclaiming their achievements and lineage. The coats of arms displayed on shields, banners, and architectural decorations created a complex visual language that communicated social status, family relationships, and historical claims throughout feudal society. The great feasts that marked important occasions in noble life demonstrated both the wealth available to aristocratic households and the social obligations that bound lords to their followers. Christmas celebrations might last for weeks, with successive days dedicated to different forms of entertainment. Formal banquets where elaborate courses were served according to strict protocols, musical performances by professional minstrels, dancing that continued late into the night, and hunting expeditions that provided both sport and practical training for warfare. Throughout all levels of medieval French society, from peasant villages to royal palaces, the rhythm of daily life was shaped by Christian faith and practice in ways that modern secular societies can barely comprehend. The medieval church was not merely an institution that people attended on Sundays, but a living presence that influenced every aspect of human existence. From the moment of birth, when baptism welcomed infants into the Christian community, to the final rites that prepared souls for their journey to eternity, the monastery remained the most distinctive institution of medieval religious life, creating communities of men and women who devoted their lives entirely to prayer, contemplation, and service to God. The great abbeys of France-Cluny with its elaborate liturgical ceremonies, Citeaux with its emphasis on agricultural labour and architectural simplicity, Saint-Denis with its royal connections and artistic treasures, became centres of spiritual authority that influenced religious development throughout Europe. The daily routine in a medieval monastery followed the horarium established by St. Benedict centuries earlier, dividing each day into periods of prayer, work, and study that created a balanced spiritual life. The monks rose before dawn for matins, the first of 7 daily prayer services that continued through prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Between these communal prayers, the monks engaged in manual labour that might include copying manuscripts, tending gardens, teaching students, or caring for pilgrims and the poor. The monastery scriptorium, where monks spent countless hours copying religious and classical texts, played a crucial role in preserving the literary heritage of Western civilization while creating some of the most beautiful artistic works of the medieval period. The illuminated manuscripts produced in these workshops combined religious devotion with artistic achievement, their decorated margins and elaborate initial letters transforming sacred texts into objects of extraordinary beauty. The parish church served as the spiritual centre of every village and urban neighbourhood, providing not only religious services but social gathering places where community news was shared, important announcements were made, and festivals were celebrated. The parish priest, often the only literate person in rural communities, served as teacher, counsellor and mediator in addition to his sacramental duties. The cathedral chapters that governed the great urban churches represented some of the most sophisticated institutions of medieval society, combining religious authority with educational leadership and economic power. The canons who served these cathedrals were typically university-trained theologians and lawyers, whose scholarship contributed to the intellectual achievements of medieval civilization, while their administrative skills managed vast ecclesiastical properties and revenues. The pilgrimage routes that connected French shrines with distant holy places created networks of spiritual and cultural exchange that transcended political boundaries while fostering economic development throughout medieval Europe. The road to Santiago de Compostela, beginning at Paris and passing through Chartres, Tours, Poitiers and the Pyrenees, became one of the most travelled highways of medieval Europe, supporting industries that provided accommodation, food, and protection for pilgrims from every social class. The religious art that adorned churches and cathedrals throughout France served not only decorative purposes but educational functions in societies where most people could not read. The sculptural programs that covered cathedral facades told biblical stories while teaching moral lessons, their figures serving as a visual Bible for illiterate congregations. The stained glass windows that filled Gothic churches with coloured light depicted saints and biblical scenes while creating spiritual environments that inspired devotion and contemplation. The mystical traditions that flourished during the later medieval period reflected the deep spiritual hunger that characterized an age when conventional religious practices seemed insufficient to address the challenges facing Christian society. The writings of mystics like Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler, though German, influenced French religious thought, while native French spiritual leaders developed distinctive traditions of contemplative prayer and religious experience. The lay religious movements that emerged during this period enabled ordinary Christians to pursue spiritual perfection without abandoning their secular occupations and family responsibilities. The third orders associated with the Franciscan and Dominican movements allowed married men and women to follow modified versions of monastic rules while remaining in the world, creating new forms of religious life that would influence Christian spirituality for centuries. The religious confraternities that flourished in medieval towns created voluntary associations of laypeople who combined devotional activities with charitable work and mutual support. These organizations, dedicated to particular saints or religious themes, built chapels, supported hospitals, cared for orphans and widows, and provided proper burials for deceased members, demonstrating how Christian charity could address practical social needs. As the medieval period drew toward its close, French society had created religious institutions and traditions that would influence European civilization for centuries to come. The synthesis of faith and reason achieved by scholastic theologians, the artistic traditions established by Gothic architects and illuminators, the charitable institutions founded by religious orders, and the mystical traditions developed by contemplatives all contributed to a spiritual heritage that would continue to inspire and challenge European Christianity throughout the early modern period and beyond. The daily life of medieval France, in all its complexity and richness, had created the human foundation upon which the political and cultural achievements we remember were built, from the peasant farmer carefully tending his fields to the monk copying manuscripts in his scriptorium, from the merchant negotiating contracts at distant fairs to the knight training for tournament combat, from the parish priest celebrating Mass to the cathedral builder raising stone arches toward heaven. Each person contributed to a civilization that, despite its limitations and challenges, achieved remarkable heights of human accomplishment and spiritual aspiration. As the bells of French cathedrals rang out across a kingdom finally freed from English occupation, and as peasant farmers returned to fields that had known peace for the first time in generations, the foundations laid during 1,000 years of medieval development would be tested by a king whose methods were as calculating as his ambitions were grand. Louis XIV, ascending the throne in 1461, inherited not only the territorial recovery achieved through Joan of Arc's inspiration and his father's patient warfare, but also the governmental institutions, cultural traditions, and sense of national identity that had emerged from the crucible of medieval French history. This king, whom contemporaries called the Spider for his preference for intrigue over open conflict, understood that the work of creating modern France required more than military victory over foreign enemies. The great feudal principalities that had dominated French politics since Carolingian times, Burgundy with its vast territories stretching from the Low Countries to the Mediterranean, Brittany with its fierce independence and Celtic traditions, Anjou with its Italian ambitions and Plantagenet memories, remained virtually autonomous despite their formal acknowledgement of royal suzerainty. The challenge that would define Louis XIV's reign emerged from the ambitions of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, whose dreams of recreating the ancient Middle Kingdom of Lothar threatened to divide France permanently while establishing a new European power capable of challenging both French and German authority. Charles possessed resources that seemed to dwarf those available to the French crown: the commercial wealth of Flemish cities, the military traditions of Burgundian nobility, the strategic advantages of territories that controlled the trade routes connecting northern and southern Europe. Yet Louis's patient diplomacy and systematic bribery proved more effective than military confrontation in isolating the Burgundian threat while building the coalitions necessary to contain Charles's territorial ambitions. The king's agents, operating throughout Europe with bags of French gold, secured Swiss alliance against Burgundian expansion, encouraged German princes to resist Charles's imperial pretensions, and even negotiated with Habsburg enemies when such negotiations served French interests. The death of Charles the Bold before the walls of Nancy in January 1477, killed in battle against Swiss forces that Louis had subsidized and encouraged, eliminated the greatest threat to French unity while creating opportunities for territorial expansion that would transform the map of France. The inheritance crisis that followed Charles's death, with his daughter, Mary of Burgundy, unable to maintain control over territories that had been held together only by her father's personal authority, enabled Louis to reclaim Burgundian lands that had been lost to French control for generations. The systematic integration of these recovered territories demonstrated the administrative sophistication that medieval French government had achieved through centuries of gradual development. Rather than simply imposing northern French law and custom on regions with their own traditions, Louis's officials worked to harmonize local practices with royal authority, creating unified governmental systems while respecting regional differences that had deep historical roots. The marriage diplomacy that secured the integration of Brittany into the French realm reflected Louis's understanding that dynastic politics could achieve territorial objectives more efficiently than military conquest. The betrothal arranged between his son, the future Charles VIII, and Anne of Brittany, heiress to the last independent duchy in France, would be completed in the following decade, bringing to an end centuries of Breton autonomy, while adding the wealth of Atlantic ports to French resources. Louis's economic policies demonstrated his recognition that commercial prosperity could provide royal government with resources more dependable than feudal obligations or extraordinary taxation imposed during military emergencies. The encouragement of urban industries, the improvement of transportation networks, the standardization of weights and measures, and the protection of merchant activities all contributed to economic growth that enabled France to support the expanded governmental apparatus necessary for effective royal administration. The silk industry that Louis established in Lyon, importing Italian craftsmen and techniques while providing French alternatives to expensive foreign luxuries, exemplified his approach to economic development. By creating domestic production capabilities that had previously required importation, the king both conserved French currency and provided employment for French workers while demonstrating royal commitment to commercial innovation. The postal system developed during Louis's reign created communication networks that enabled royal government to coordinate policies throughout the expanding kingdom, while facilitating the commercial activities that generated increasing revenues. Regular courier routes, maintained at royal expense, connected Paris with provincial administrative centres, enabling the rapid transmission of orders and information that effective central government required. The cultural transformation that accompanied political consolidation reflected the gradual penetration of Renaissance ideas into French intellectual life, creating new syntheses that combined traditional Gothic traditions with classical influences imported from Italy. The royal court itself became a centre of cultural innovation, as Louis XIV and his successors attracted scholars, artists and craftsmen whose work established new standards of artistic achievement while maintaining distinctively French characteristics. The introduction of printing to France during the 1470s revolutionized the production and distribution of books, while making sophisticated cultural works accessible to audiences far beyond the clerical and noble classes that had traditionally monopolized literacy. The printing shops established in Paris, Lyon, and other commercial centres began producing not only religious texts and classical literature, but also vernacular works that reflected growing confidence in French as a medium for serious intellectual expression. The first books printed in Paris included not only Latin religious texts, but also French translations of classical authors, vernacular poetry, and practical manuals that served the needs of merchants, craftsmen, and administrators. The workshop of Antoine Vérard, producing beautifully illustrated books for wealthy patrons, demonstrated that printing could achieve artistic standards comparable to the finest manuscript illumination while reaching much larger audiences than had been possible during the manuscript era. The humanist scholarship that characterized Italian Renaissance intellectual life began to influence French universities and cathedral schools during the late 15th century, introducing new approaches to classical literature, historical studies, and theological investigation. French scholars who had studied in Italian universities returned home with knowledge of Greek language and literature, new methods of textual criticism, and fresh approaches to philosophical questions that had occupied medieval thinkers for centuries. The architectural innovations that appeared in French buildings during this period reflected the gradual adoption of Renaissance principles, while maintaining the Gothic traditions that had achieved such remarkable success in earlier centuries. The chateau constructed by royal and noble patrons combined medieval defensive features with Renaissance decorative elements, creating distinctively French architectural styles that would influence European building for generations. The Château of Amboise, rebuilt by Charles VI following his Italian campaigns, demonstrated how French architecture could incorporate Renaissance ideas while maintaining traditional forms suited to northern climate and defensive requirements. The great spiral staircase that became a signature feature of French Renaissance architecture, the elaborate dormer windows that provided light while creating distinctive roof lines, and the formal gardens that extended architectural design into the surrounding landscape, all represented innovations that would characterize French building for centuries. The artistic patronage that flourished during this period attracted craftsmen from throughout Europe to French courts, while encouraging native French artists to develop new techniques and themes. The workshop of Jean Fouquet, combining traditional French manuscript illumination with Renaissance innovations in perspective and classical motifs, created distinctive artistic syntheses that influenced European book production while establishing precedents for French Renaissance painting. The musical developments that characterized late 15th century France reflected both continuing medieval traditions and new influences from Italian and Flemish sources. The Chapel Royal, reorganizing under royal patronage, became a center of musical innovation that attracted composers and performers from throughout Europe while establishing French musical traditions that would influence European development for generations. As the 15th century drew toward its close and France prepared to enter the early modern period, the achievements of medieval civilization had created foundations that would support French greatness for centuries to come. The administrative systems developed through patient trial and adaptation, the legal traditions that harmonized local customs with universal principles, the cultural institutions that preserved and transmitted learning across generations, and the sense of national identity forged through shared struggle against foreign domination, all represented legacies that would influence European development far beyond the boundaries of medieval chronology. The royal administration that had evolved from the primitive household government of early Capuchin kings into the sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus of Louis XV's reign provided France with governmental capabilities unmatched anywhere in medieval Europe. The network of royal officials that extended throughout the kingdom, the systematic collection and preservation of administrative records, the development of specialized governmental departments, and the creation of legal procedures that could implement royal policies at local levels all established precedents for the absolute monarchy that would characterize early modern French government. The legal unification that had been achieved through centuries of patient work to harmonize regional customs with universal principles created judicial systems that could provide consistent justice throughout French territories while respecting local traditions that reflected deep historical roots. The great legal compilations of the late medieval period recording and systematizing customary law while establishing procedures for royal courts, provided foundations for the comprehensive legal codes that would eventually govern all aspects of French society. The cultural and linguistic unification that had gradually transformed the diverse populations of medieval Gaul into a unified French nation represented perhaps the most remarkable achievement of medieval civilization. The standardization of French language that had resulted from royal administration, commercial exchange, and cultural interaction created communication tools that enabled effective governance while preserving regional dialects that maintained local identity. The literary traditions established by medieval French authors, the architectural achievements of Gothic builders, and the intellectual contributions of French scholars all created cultural foundations that would support French claims to European leadership. The territorial integration that had been achieved through centuries of patient expansion, military conquest, and diplomatic maneuvering created geographical unity that provided France with natural boundaries while encompassing diverse regions whose varied resources contributed to national strength. The incorporation of Normandy and Anjou, Languedoc and Burgundy into unified royal administration created the largest and most populous kingdom in medieval Europe, while establishing territorial foundations that would remain essentially unchanged for centuries. The Gothic heritage that represented perhaps the most visible legacy of medieval French civilization continued to dominate European architectural development, while providing spiritual and cultural inspiration that transcended religious boundaries. The great cathedrals that rose throughout France during the High Middle Ages established engineering principles and artistic traditions that influenced building throughout Europe while creating sacred spaces that continued to inspire devotion and wonder centuries after their construction. The educational institutions that had been established during the medieval period, particularly the University of Paris and its sister institutions throughout France, created intellectual traditions that would continue to influence European thought throughout the early modern period. The scholastic synthesis achieved by medieval theologians and philosophers, the preservation of classical literature in monastery libraries, and the development of vernacular literary traditions all contributed to intellectual foundations that would support French cultural leadership for generations. The economic systems that had evolved during the medieval period, from the agricultural innovations that increased rural productivity to the commercial networks that connected French merchants with markets throughout the known world, created material foundations for the prosperity that would enable France to maintain European leadership while supporting the cultural achievements that would characterize French Renaissance civilization. As medieval France gave way to early modern monarchy, the achievements of 10 centuries had created a unified kingdom whose governmental institutions, cultural traditions, territorial extent, and national identity would enable French civilization to dominate European development for generations to come. The transformation from tribal kingdoms to unified monarchy, from local customs to national law, from regional dialects to standardized language, from feudal fragmentation to royal centralization, represented collective human achievement whose influence would extend far beyond the chronological boundaries of the medieval period itself. The France that emerged from medieval development possessed both the institutional capabilities and cultural confidence necessary for European leadership, while the traditions established during these formative centuries would continue to influence French national character throughout subsequent periods of triumph and challenge, expansion and revolution, that would mark the continuing evolution of one of Europe's most remarkable civilizations. As we reach the end of our journey through 1,000 years of French medieval history, from the mist-shrouded forests where Clovis first united the Frankish tribes to the Renaissance courts where printing presses began producing books that would spread French culture throughout Europe, we can observe how the patient work of countless generations created foundations that continue to shape our world today. The medieval centuries, often dismissed in popular imagination as a dark interlude between classical antiquity and Renaissance enlightenment, emerge instead as a period of remarkable creativity, institutional innovation, and cultural achievement that established many of the fundamental patterns of European civilization. The legal traditions that emerged from medieval French development provided Europe with governmental concepts that would influence political theory and administrative practice for centuries beyond the medieval period itself. The systematic law codes that had evolved from the fusion of Roman legal principles with Germanic customs, Celtic traditions, and Christian moral teaching created jurisprudential frameworks that balanced royal authority with individual rights, central coordination with local autonomy, written law with customary practice. These medieval legal innovations would eventually inspire the great legal codifications of the early modern period, while establishing precedents for constitutional government that would influence democratic development throughout the Western world. The administrative systems perfected during the long evolution from Carolingian household government to the sophisticated royal bureaucracy of Louis X provided European monarchy with techniques of governance that enabled the creation of unified nation-states capable of mobilizing national resources for both peaceful development and military defense. The royal officials who had gradually extended central authority throughout medieval France, the financial institutions that had learned to coordinate taxation and expenditure on an unprecedented scale, and the diplomatic services that had managed complex international relationships all established governmental capabilities that would enable France to dominate European politics throughout the early modern period. The cultural contributions of medieval France to European civilization extended far beyond the political and administrative spheres to encompass intellectual, artistic, and spiritual achievements that would inspire human creativity for centuries to come. The University of Paris, with its synthesis of classical learning and Christian theology, created educational models that were copied throughout Europe, while establishing intellectual traditions that would influence Western thought throughout subsequent centuries. The scholastic philosophy developed by medieval French thinkers provided frameworks for understanding the relationship between faith and reason that would continue to influence theological and philosophical discussion long after the medieval period itself had passed into history. The architectural and artistic heritage of medieval France remains perhaps the most visible testament to the creative achievements of this remarkable civilization. The Gothic cathedrals that rose throughout France during the High Middle Ages established engineering principles and aesthetic standards that influenced building throughout Europe, while creating sacred spaces whose spiritual power continues to move visitors from every religious and cultural background. Notre Dame of Paris, Chartres Cathedral, Sainte-Chapelle, and hundreds of other French Gothic churches demonstrated humanity's capacity to transform stone and glass into expressions of divine aspiration while establishing architectural traditions that would inspire builders throughout the Western world. The manuscript illumination that flourished in French monasteries and secular workshops created artistic traditions that would influence European visual culture for generations, while the development of distinctive French styles in metalwork, textile production, and decorative arts established standards of craftsmanship that would make French luxury goods sought after throughout the known world. These artistic achievements reflected not only individual creativity, but also the sophisticated economic systems and cultural institutions that could support such elaborate artistic production, while preserving artistic works for future generations to appreciate and study. The literary and intellectual traditions established during the medieval period created the foundations of French cultural identity, while contributing to the development of European vernacular literature. The chansons de geste that celebrated Charlemagne and his knights, the courtly romances that explored themes of love and chivalry, and the historical chronicles that preserved memory of great events, all established literary precedents that would influence European writing for centuries. The development of French as a sophisticated language capable of expressing complex philosophical, theological, and scientific ideas provided France with cultural tools that would enable French intellectual leadership throughout subsequent periods of European history. The territorial boundaries that had been established through centuries of medieval expansion, consolidation, and diplomatic maneuvering created geographical foundations that would remain essentially unchanged throughout subsequent French history. The incorporation of Normandy and Anjou, Languedoc and Burgundy, Brittany and the Eastern Territories into a unified kingdom, created the essential France that would dominate European politics for centuries to come. This territorial integration represented not merely military conquest, but the patient work of cultural assimilation that transformed diverse populations into a unified nation capable of coordinated action under royal leadership. The regional integration that had been achieved through medieval administrative development demonstrated how centralized authority could coexist with local traditions, creating governmental systems that could maintain unity while respecting diversity. The provincial institutions that had evolved during the medieval period, the legal systems that had harmonized local customs with universal principles, and the economic networks that had connected distant regions into integrated markets all established patterns of national organization that would enable France to function effectively as a unified state while maintaining the regional characteristics that contributed to French cultural richness. The monarchical traditions that had evolved from the tribal kingship of early medieval chieftains into the sophisticated royal government of late medieval France provided European monarchy with models of effective rulership that would influence royal government throughout the continent. The concept of sacred kingship that had developed from Clovis's baptism through the canonization of Louis IX established precedents for royal authority that combined practical governmental effectiveness with spiritual legitimacy, creating frameworks for monarchy that would persist throughout the early modern period. The state-building techniques that had been developed during the medieval period provided early modern European governments with administrative tools that enabled the creation of powerful centralized states capable of mobilizing national resources on an unprecedented scale. The tax systems that had evolved to support royal armies, the diplomatic services that had managed complex international relationships, the legal institutions that had provided consistent justice throughout national territories, and the military organizations that had maintained internal order while defending against foreign threats all established governmental capabilities that would enable France to achieve European hegemony during subsequent centuries. As we reflect upon this remarkable 1,000-year transformation, from the tribal settlements of post-Roman Gaul to the unified kingdom that would soon project French power throughout Europe and beyond, we can appreciate the patient work of countless individuals whose contributions created one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The peasant farmers who had maintained agricultural productivity through periods of war and famine, the monks who had preserved classical learning while developing new forms of Christian spirituality, the craftsmen who had created objects of extraordinary beauty while developing new techniques of production, the merchants who had created commercial networks that connected French markets with trading centres throughout the known world, the nobles who had provided military leadership while patronizing cultural achievement, and the kings who had gradually transformed feudal fragmentation into national unity, all contributed to achievements that would influence European development for centuries to come. The daily rhythms of medieval life, from the seasonal cycles that governed agricultural communities to the prayer schedules that structured monastic existence, from the market days that brought together urban populations to the feast days that celebrated religious holidays, created patterns of human community that demonstrated civilization's capacity to create meaning and beauty even amid the challenges and uncertainties that characterize all human existence. The France that emerged from medieval development possessed both the institutional capabilities and cultural confidence necessary for European leadership, while the traditions established during these formative centuries would continue to influence French national character throughout subsequent periods of triumph and challenge that would mark the continuing evolution of European civilization. The medieval legacy, preserved in stone cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts, in legal codes and administrative procedures, in literary works and intellectual traditions, continues to enrich human culture while providing inspiration for those who seek to understand how patient human effort can create lasting achievements that transcend the limitations of any single generation. In these quiet moments as we conclude our journey through medieval France, we can appreciate how the work of these distant centuries created foundations that continue to support human flourishing, while inspiring continued efforts to build civilizations worthy of humanity's highest aspirations. The medieval French experience demonstrates that even in periods of apparent chaos and uncertainty, human creativity and determination can create lasting achievements that enrich the common heritage of all humanity.